So Miyazaki, anything you want to admit? It doesn't take some super gamer gene to play Dark Souls. Mostly it's time and a lot of coffee. If you're watching this, you probably play games, so I know you've heard it all before. Dark Souls is so hard. Dark Souls created the next great game genre. Dark Souls is the Dark Souls of Dark Souls. It's a series so massively memed and mythologized about, it can be hard to get a clear picture of the games. But at the KBash show, we like to cut through the bullshit and make incisive points. And it's not gonna be easy. The series has coverage out the ass, longer than the sum of its runtimes. So what's a YouTuber supposed to do? Give their perspective. That's it. It's all you can do. But that's the beauty of Souls games. They put the player on a pedestal and shower them with gold. Your playthrough hits most of the same beats of any other, but it's something you craft and earn and scream through.
Oh no, come on!
It's the kind of series you can share stories about, and that's true of other multiplayer games, but at least these turn into competent solo experiences offline, and sometimes it makes them better. It means you're not being relentlessly force-fed, quote, jokes at every turn. Try finger, butthole! Now this is part 1 of my long-form Dark Souls retrospective, funded by patrons. Thank you for letting me drink a lot of coffee. I would die 1,000 times for you. And I did. Probably twice. With righteous motivation and a really big sword, I battered down every game almost completely solo, and I'll disclose which version I played in its respective segment, but for now, let's armor up, strap on our think brain caps, and get killing. They say that only wicked men seek fortune and fame in the very gravel of life's long road, but that was never my intention. 3 months hence, the dark spirit came to me, whispering doom in my ear.
Oh, another patron goal. KBash.
No, we are not doing this shit again. Please!
You are required to review the Dark Souls games.
But I already wanted to do that!
Or you will be cursed to undeath and eternal madness.
Have you seen my show lately? Do you think that's a new life experience?
Spare me your spirits and your high-minded gods. Speak not of greed or fame. It is the will of the people that drives me ever onward. Demon's Souls is a 2009 PS3 title from the studio that brought you most of the coolest games ever made. Lost Kingdoms, Otogi. It's actually kind of criminal it took this long to get proper recognition. I'm playing on the original version myself, not the PS5 remaster, but you know, if you've got $1,000 you'd like to donate, please, don't let me stop you. And now I get to sneer and pretend it's because I'm a gaming historian. Yes. Demon's Souls is kind of peak KBash core. It's why I love games and looking at series in full. What can I say? It's a high-quality 7th console-gen dark fantasy action RPG and the genuine origin point of an entire gaming subgenre. It's history. Jesus, what happened to my pants? And it's hard to imagine skipping the thing. Dark Souls itself may be a trilogy, but Demon's Souls is part of the mainline games, part of the lineage. It isn't an optional offering, it's a prototype, a blueprint of design sensibilities that were carried along and resonated going forward. Things once exclusive to Demon's Souls came back in later games. It's in the list for a reason. I cover a lot of anime aesthetic games on the channel, and all kinds of genres, but I like lots of things. My favorite aesthetic, though, my bread and butter, is low-key dark fantasy, so medieval-era technology, swords and shields, magic, but not too much, just a pinch, okay? Just a little pinch. Demon's Souls is the coziest thing I've played all year. I know that sounds crazy, but hey, high-rise rooftops or astroturfed suburb, when you're home, you're home. I was excited to walk into hell, and I'm glad I did. Not doing much to dispel the masochist allegations. The player isn't fed a ton of context outright, but the Souls games like delivering info less directly than your average AAA title. Arguably, Demon's Souls tells more than the later games. It intros with a trailer that invokes biblical language, you know, on the first day, etc. Only there's 2 days. Day 1, people and souls. Day 2, demons. Wow, that's rough. I bring this up because some people like to say the games are depressing, and they are, but it's worth noting that even in the game's opening cutscene, people perceive evil. Hope is inherent to the Souls experience. Life sucks, but question mark? You create a character who Guys, come on, you can't make that the default. You create a character, select a class that determines how miserable or easy your intro will be, and a starting gift. Just a consumable that may or may not make things easier. I really like the burden of choice here. Appearance doesn't mean anything, but picking your starting weapon, your earliest stats, and something as small as a one-time consumable puts a lot of trust in the player. Treats them like a human. I can respect that, especially because if you grasp the basic mechanics, it's all trivial, but this early feels important. You're stepping into the world, but on your terms. Another cutscene hands the player a whole lot more than the first. The kingdom of Boletaria was a land made prosperous by the king via the power of souls. A strange fog rolls in and turns the nation upside down. Demons are walking out of the fog and driving men mad. World's gone crazy. Apparently the king was meddling with powers beyond his control. It's a classic setup. Icarus did it, kind of. Babylon did it, kind of. Reaching too far and falling is an old story. What isn't is making the hero do the exact thing that led the king to ruin. Your entire purpose in Demon Souls is to do what no mere mortal can. Become extremely powerful by using the power of souls. Souls gathered by killing immensely powerful demons. And then topple the king. You're explicitly cast as the hero of the story. You're explicitly told to kill every last demon. You're the world's last hope. Alright, FromSoft, I see you roping my gamer ass in with the promise of big RPG number, obscene ultra murder, and a potentially compelling narrative payoff. It's okay. We can skip the drink. I hate going through the absolute basics, but I'm assuming some viewers are Souls babbies, so simplicity is at the heart of the Souls game's beauty. You're there, in 3D space, meandering around the world with some items in your pack, at least one weapon, and sometimes a shield. You don't use the face buttons to attack. Your arms are accessed with the shoulder buttons. It's a neat feature, tacking 2 buttons onto each arm and leaving the interacting, stance changing, item handling, and dodge rolling to face buttons. It's an incredibly basic set of controls for something propped up as super difficult. It reminds me just vaguely enough of Chivalry and Soul Calibur 2 and Sam Show that way. Easy enough to grasp, but highly deadly. That's the kind of tension I can get lost in. Death always seconds away. Stranglewink style. But for the most part, death's gonna be on you. Well, at least I know that's there now. The tutorial isn't exciting, but it does something I really like. The Souls games use vertical level design often, and the intro stage has a broken rampart you're meant to jump from. No guidance, fall damage exists, you just have to do it, and it's nothing really super basic, but informs the player about what to expect and trains them to engage without a pop-up, without a word. You're rewarded for splashing around in the kiddie pool with a thrashing so sound you're mulched in seconds. I think the visceral weight of your loss here, the total unfairness of the situation, makes people think that the cruelty is the point. I reject that. Yes, the game just beat me within an inch of my life after a clean tutorial run and rubbed the burning end of a cigarette into my forehead, and spit on me, and stepped on me. But the context matters. You're still the kingdom's only hope. You're gonna need more power to kill demons like that, and you're introduced immediately to a woman who can channel the power of souls into you for power-ups. It's just part of the tutorial. Dying is part of the game, so you lost some souls. Every enemy in the game ranges from a soul baggie to a soul pinata. Get boppin'. Dying drops your souls, like Sonic, but the rings stay. Unless you die on the return trip, then they're gone for good. Hey, no one said you can't run all the way through the level, ignoring everything in your path to snatch up your souls again. And every level you can pump into your character is permanent. Whatever souls you ferry back home to channel into yourself, nobody can touch those. The Souls games push choice from the very beginning, but soon after they push something much more powerful: individual sovereignty, control of yourself and what you've earned. Purely in terms of mechanics, these are not antagonistic games. They reward effort and cunning, make a monument of the player who persists. I mean, don't let me tell you that. On death, the game brings you to the Nexus, where you meet the aforementioned Soul Channeler and the long-running Souls community meme, the Crestfallen Warrior. These are the first 2 characters you meet in the same room. They're symbolic of the 2 paths, okay? Play the game and synthesize, consolidate, become, or be the guy who got filtered and tearfully posts about how it's not for them. It is with a heavy heart that I have personally deemed Demon Souls too hard. It's just not made for me, and that's okay. Can someone get this man a tissue? Demon's Souls is dense with important information. I like skimming things, but it's hard when the very first level preceding the tutorial lays the groundwork for the remaining experience. So, you're dropped outside the castle, fight your way up to the gate, can't get in, and realize you have to find another way. You can pick up some items in the castle grounds, and climbing the nearby tower, then poking around yields a couple of chains. You're not prompted at any point, but it seems logical that breaking the chains could help, so you do. Door opened. Problem solved. The first level is fascinating for a lot of reasons. The vertical and narrow level design forcing the player to not rely so heavily on their basic horizontal swings, the easily dispatched but erratic soldier enemies contrasting the much more imposing sword and board knights, the little pathway leading to a level inappropriate enemy who'll just send you to hell in a flash. No! The multiple explorable branches from the main path. The dragon! Man, the dragon! There's a side path near a bridge that leads to a dragon horde. Treasures are visibly guarded by a pair of dragons, but if you take the main path, one of them audibly roars, flies over, and roasts the bridge if you linger. So you think, maybe I can hit the bridge, wait for the audio cue, lure the dragon over while running to the horde, and yes you can. The shield is really good too, incidentally. And you're never told this stuff. It isn't mind-blowing, not really, but at a time when games were aggressively filling your HUD with notifications and breadcrumb trails and quest markers. It's such a cleanse, living in the moment because you can die any moment, inhabiting your character, because every point you invest matters, getting interested in the levels organically because the good stuff is everywhere, and there's no waypoint. It even caps the very first section of the game off with a nice narrative tie-in. You only encounter humanoids and the two dragons, but as you get deeper into the level, you start finding these bizarre, spear-wielding oozes, like, what? And if you weren't listening to the opening cutscenes, it's suddenly really obvious that some really messed up stuff is going on with the kingdom. The first boss isn't hard, but it's a pile of gross spear-chucking oozes. I mean, Miyazaki, what the hell? I want to move past the first level, but it's also worth discussing the aesthetic elements of Demon's Souls. The Boletarian Palace is a washed-out, austere environment, and that describes most of the other levels as well. If they're not cold and desolate, they're forlorn and gloomy. The absolute range on this bit. The atmosphere quite literally slides between barren and moody. That's about the full array of pathos on offer, excepting boss fights in general. I understand that actually affects some players who find it overly depressing, but I really dig games focusing on combat in and around fortresses and battlements. Too much Kingdom of Heaven as a kid. Who knows? The levels also serve to highlight the sense of heroism the narrative wants to instill. Everyone else is demented, deformed, or insane. Among the few people left unscathed by the horrors of the fog, you alone can wield a weapon, resist insanity, and continue to grow, even thrive in a world that's almost entirely hostile. That's true of almost every NPC you meet, by the way. The Demon's Souls supporting cast isn't particularly expensive or fleshed out, but they're almost all the exact people who'd still be alive in this hell world. And it's not all hyper-bleak dark fantasy stuff. Sometimes there's flaming salamanders. Just some funny little guys. The music sometimes fits the mood flawlessly. A lot of the time, the game is totally silent, but the boss fights make use of almost grating bombast, really booming tracks. It's all acceptable, and it's hard to nail the vibe of something on a first pass. I like to think that the intro movie song, became the cleric beast theme in Bloodborne. Personal headcanon there. Regardless, outside of boss fights, the audio design, the music, isn't cueing you into combat like Assassin's Creed or Fable do. You can be stalked off camera and not realize until it's too late. I imagine that's contentious for some people, but enemies make noises just like you. And frankly, the Souls games demand a level of alertness that often renders enemy surprise attacks powerless if the game is working. When you get sucked in, the only thing pushing you out is something too difficult. I think it's a clever and intentional choice, utilizing the negative space created by removing music as part of the greater web of immersive design. That was a lot of words. You know what's not? Explaining where to go next. That can be a real issue in later games. You're not often guided directly by the level design until Dark Souls 2, and you can still waltz into high-powered areas regardless. They'll let you hop from the Shire to Mordor if you go out of your way. But in Demon's Souls, you're dropped into the hub, the Nexus, and given a series of teleportation stones to browse. Each segment of the various worlds is given a number code. 1-1, 1-2, etc. And you figure out pretty quick that you're always capable of handling the level 1 version of each world, and you should complete them in that order. Basically, there's a few stipulations, but they're mostly irrelevant, like getting to finger each pie before— that is not how I should have said that. And yeah, at this time, the bonfire system of modern Souls wasn't a thing. Demon's Souls gives very specific checkpoints and asks the player to actively engage with the world almost all of the time. You might think that makes the game harder than later titles, and some levels definitely suffer from overlong corpse runs, but this early entry is actually one of the most forgiving. I mean, it's patting your ass and telling you where to go. You're the hero! Goo goo gaga! I can't even joke about that stuff. At the baseline, Souls games demand more from the player than most. It's part of the allure, but Demons is kinder. The levels in Souls games are interesting, aesthetically, structurally, narratively as well. There's a lot going on in such a simple game. This discussion in particular opens up massively in the Dark Souls trilogy, so let's lay the groundwork. You load into levels without much direction or purpose because those things are understood. Your goal is to get strong and kill demons, exactly what the game already told you. The demons are all in front of you, the path is laid bare, and the world isn't interconnected like other Souls games. It's video gamey in a way that the rest of the series isn't. While the world isn't as majestic or grand, because it's trying to play like Mario, it feels a lot better choosing to disengage from the world tactically. Scenario: you're a new Souls player and you're running through the game, but it's really hard. You keep dying and losing souls because you forget to bank them and get cocky. You meticulously clean every area of enemies on the way to your souls-laden corpse and routinely have trouble doing so. You're low on healing items and the game feels impossible. Only, nobody said you had to engage, right? I feel like the biggest stumbling block for new Souls players is pride, ego, assuming that the player is meant to deal with every obstacle honestly. It's okay, sweetie, as long as she says it's enough, it's enough. If the game wanted you to clear every room, you'd be locked in at the start of combat like DMC, but that's not what happens. You're allowed to engage and disengage at your leisure, and it's a necessary skill to develop early. Yeah, it runs contrary to the player's stated purpose, kill every last demon. Yes, it makes it feel like a video game and breaks immersion slightly, but you notice that when you die, every enemy except the bosses comes back. Maybe there's more to your purpose than being a tool in an endless war. Maybe you need to focus on what really matters, using the levels to empower yourself and killing the bosses. That's the real design intention for the player, and it's all conveyed passively. You can't possibly keep killing meaningless throwaway demons. The world is burning. Get a move on. If that weren't the case, the game would throw screaming peasants into the streets for quick hero points, but instead you're met with stark, barren worlds inundated with hostile enemies and the occasional unreliable NPC. So grab what you can and go. One mildly important thing I've neglected is the penalty for death. Losing half your HP until you restore yourself with a consumable item. Kind of a big deal. Only the game undercuts that dramatic punishment very early. Anyone who goes digging in the levels, and you'll definitely feel compelled to, ends up finding the Cling Ring, which reduces the soul form HP penalty to 75% of max HP. Makes the game so much easier, and it's found in a mild branch from the main path in the very first level. Actually, a lot of the game is like that. Every time I faced something that was ridiculous, felt overwhelming and badly designed, namely the flying manta rays and the Shrine of Storms, some item existed that completely erased the misery. You can pick up the Thief Ring in the first level as well, and it stops the manta rays from skewering you at range. For the most part, really helpful on obnoxious cliffside treks. The infamous Poison Swamp was awful until I equipped some items that slowly regen health, and it turned the level upside down. Completely positive experience afterwards. And that's janky and gamey, especially because those things are all missable. But like I said, Demon's Souls rewards persistence, player engagement, massively. As for distrust, the game is pretty clear about everyone being driven mad by the hunt for souls in the fog, but occasionally you'll meet a decent person, or more frustratingly, not have access to the one sane person you meet until you find a key in another level. The game doesn't make connecting with others easy. It's worth noting that several characters have hidden side quests you'd likely never get through on your own. This review doesn't account for the online era of Souls writ large, something I mostly missed out on, but in those days, players could ruin each other's days by invading each other's worlds, choose to be temporarily helpful, leave messages cobbled together from a word list provided by the game. It's fascinating because these things, taken in sum, cast the world of Souls as fundamentally untrustworthy. Another player could be friendly or ill-intentioned, but you'll never know unless you interact enough to find out. I genuinely can't think of a game that sums up all the shitty parts of humanity better. It's actually art, a perfect summary told in systems. And in case you're not online, the game makes this idea real apparent with two NPCs. One, sitting above a boss room, will straight up lie to you that he's doing nothing and should be left alone. If you leave him alone, he resurrects the boss in the next room forever.
Okay, it says here that this guy actually resurrects the boss forever. Let the record show that this man can suck my chunk.
It's actually kind of funny, in a sick way. Then Yurt, the Silent Chief, one of the heroes mentioned in the first major cutscene, is locked in a cage and asks to be let out. If you let him out freely, because he's a hero, he'll kill the NPCs in the Nexus one by one because he's also a murderer. That's your reward for being kind. Now, I played Bloodborne years before this, and have worked with human beings, so needless to say, I trust no one. I don't feel bad stopping to look these things up. It's part of the experience, and something you learn by tapping into the creator's vision. Like when people say trust is the hardest thing to earn back, they're not joking. I remember what you did to my chapel friends, Miyazaki. I'll never forget. Other than items and the occasional person, you're mostly left with combat in the levels. I mean, structure matters too. It's directly related to combat. I love the dingy, scrappy environments, you know, the little raised sections, the ramparts, the stair sections, the tight corridors, every set piece that recontextualizes battle. Yes, some of the levels have other stuff going on, like the light platforming for items, but it's not super sophisticated overall. So combat. Enemies start quaint and get progressively bizarre and dangerous as the game unfolds, and that's expected. It's foreshadowed in the first level, but seriously, the rolling skeletons of the Storm Shrine, whatever's going on in the swamp with these things and those freaks from the tower.
Oh yeah, stun attacks are fun. Yeah. Okay. Okay, am I seriously just like locked forever in this? Can this enemy just stunlock you? I'm throwing this on YouTube. They're gonna. What are you going?
Many enemies are lethal, and even when they're not, the game is absolutely going to throw 8 of whatever at you to make sure your life is hard. And that makes sense. The world is cruel. Life sucks, but like you'd expect, engaging cautiously, at a distance, or not at all, makes things a breeze. Just remember you're not a superhero and you'll be fine. It's a slow, methodical system that rewards patience, awareness, deliberate action, and quick decision-making. And it's hard to make sweeping statements about because your build dictates your playthrough. A sword and board soldier will play completely alien compared to a mage, and it will impact the experience. Some enemies become trivial, some bosses turn miserable. Some segments that you can blow through with a good stabbing weapon or a ranged attack become unbearable with a sweeping weapon. It's a system with so many minute variables that it resists critique from single playthrough people, but certain fundamentals are always relevant. Anyone can use at least a basic shield, and blocking goes a long way to keeping your skin on. Dodge rolling is extremely effective, but only if you're not over-encumbered, leading to the infamous fat roll. Souls are important, but arguably more important is upgrading your weapon frequently to boost damage potential, as is sticking to 1 or 2 weapons only to ensure you have enough upgrade materials to get through the game. So while respecting the system is important, player choice is at the forefront. That bit I made about sovereignty earlier. Every soul level is permanent, and doubly so because there aren't any respec options. Yeah, no redo. You're stuck with your choices. Enjoy your BA in theater. I can't talk. I have a BA in English. It's not much different than something like Diablo's older games, but in 2009, it's a weird piece of design anachronism. Even Diablo 2 hands you a free redo once per playthrough. It could have thrown you a bone, but they didn't. Jesus Christ, guy, I'm just asking for a little more. Okay. The build. The Souls games make a point of making you distrust NPCs, making side quests inaccessible, hiding design trivializing items, and making level ups permanent. You'll often hit a lull early on after a few quick wins when the difficulty suddenly spikes and you're not sure what to do with your character. You could rely on online folks for some of those NPC and side quest things, but not for your build. At this point, you either put the game down or reclaim your playthrough, generally by going online and figuring out what you're gonna end up as. It's hard to feel bad about after Yurt slaughtered all your NPC friends, and hey, internet age game, they knew what they were doing. For Demon Souls, I went strength, faith. I was going to end up with a blessed claymore, but settled for the slug-infested Sword of Moonlight. What? Ugh. You generally want to level up your health and one attacking stat from strength, dexterity, intelligence, and faith, and then hybridize in some way. One of the most common builds is quality, so strength and dexterity, which gives you access to most armor, most weapons, good shields, and a ranged option with bows. It's a good strat. Builds really are the spice of the game, where the levels can get boring or repetitive, especially when you've seen them a few times. Who you are and how you interact with it all is the real story of play. By the end, I was wearing the armor of the traitor I sussed out. Well, wielding a sword that cuts through guarding enemies and hauling around a shield that healed me over time. It's not the strongest build, but it do work. The trouble with the builds is, once you've built yours, you don't need to bother looking around levels anymore. You know, I don't need the great staff of Guibus the Grandiloquent. Found in level 3-3, my weapon is fine. There's a triumph of design in that, though. It means finding a path, a purpose can do what the design already encourages, getting what you need and rising above what's immediately in front of you, and focusing on the real threat. The bosses. What stands out about Demon Souls bosses, at least compared to other games, is how many are just downright curb stomps. Phalanx teaches the player not to tunnel vision too hard on a single enemy, to play guerrilla style, but it's an easy fight. The Tower Knight reinforces the players have to clean their plate before eating dessert, i.e. clear the archers and take out the boss. He's so slow and telegraphed it's actually funny. The Armor Spider breathes fire, surprisingly, but with the right gear you can effectively tank through the flames and put it down no problem. The Adjudicator is one of the absolute weakest bosses in the series if you just walk up and hug ass. Many of the battles highlight the importance of playing defensively, like the Adjudicator and the Tower Knight are simple if you can just make use of decently timed dodge rolls. The Old King, who meanders around blindly, can hurt you badly, but only if you go in swinging. Mindfulness matters. Otherwise, a couple of the bosses teach the player about staying mobile. The Maneater is a duo of gargoyles that will destroy you if you stay put and get careless, but effective movement should make it easier than not, and the Leechmonger is simple, but only if you take advantage of the stage, moving around to dodge its slow attacks and punishing when he's open. You'll notice that most of these are battles of environmental mastery. No worries, I watched Yu-Gi-Oh! And I remember Catapult Turtle hammering Castle of Dark Illusions flotation disc, okay? This is baby stuff. The game even introduces the first gimmick boss fight where you'll equip a specific weapon to take the thing down all cinematic-like, and the Dragon God that takes surviving a small navigation segment to finish off. Both of these would become series tradition. I need to mention healing items here, because Demon Souls is different than the other games, and most similar to Bloodborne, with its farmables. Yeah, I know all about consumable grass. I have never done drugs. I live a life of cold order. You can only consistently heal with magic and consumable grass, and you absolutely can find a farming spot and stockpile weed to crush any fight in the game. Only takes time. I actually like the grass system a lot. It sucks when you're low and farming is lame, that's true, but if you need it and farm it, it's a reliable option to brute force any fight. Still, I like most of the bosses for existing with intention, making a point of something in particular, but they aren't the fights you remember. People remember the total packages, the ones that combine speed, range, and tight dodge windows. The ones that aren't gimmicks or tests of particular skills, but rather your skills in sum. The ones that were hard. The Flame Lurker, the Penetrator, Maiden Estrella, and the final boss, all of these require a good weapon and a refined understanding of the game's mechanics. You'll get hard filtered by the Flame Lurker if you're not stocked up with healing items. Don't pay attention to animation and audio cues, and don't dodge and punish fast and hard. That's true of the Penetrator as well. But the Maiden fight is even more bizarre, taking place in a player-hostile environment with a deadly poison floor full of babies that'll stun-lock you. Have I gotten so desensitized that I'm not even reacting to a pond of blood babies? The only other path requires facing down another player-type enemy who's armored up. While these fights can be trivial with certain strategies, they all feel more official for calling on player mastery. One major mechanic I've avoided is world tendency. The game's worlds become progressively crummier if you do bad things, and slightly better if you do good things. Like, enemies will actually get stronger if you're bad. It's kind of on the nose, narratively. Good for challenge runs, probably won't impact your playthrough much if you're offline. I played solo and didn't think twice, but I like that FromSoft in this title is pushing the heroic angle hardest. It's clear that this world, of all worlds, could use a hero. Anyway, you'll eventually confront the king, the source of decay in the land, a person cast in pure white, brimming with power, only to kill him. and realize the game isn't finished. You still have to end the game. Decide the fate of the world only you could save. You're led to the husk of Allant, the true body of the king. Turns out you just fought a shadow, a replica. Allant tries to reason with you, but any player who's been paying attention knows not to trust what they hear. Demon's Souls has 2 endings, and the only real good ending requires putting the old god back to sleep peacefully. It's a quiet finish, something like an epilogue segment of gameplay after the peak of the final boss. It's that, or become Allant yourself and hasten the end of the world. I'd argue there's hardly anything of value in that ending. Ending society, ending everything, makes sense in a vacuum. People are untrustworthy or warped beyond humanity. The world is gripped in madness, but you have to remember that this game features only a fraction of the greater world, a single kingdom. You could extrapolate that all people are fundamentally villainous and parasitic and absolutely deserving of eradication, and generally inhabit a world of endless strife. But all I'm saying is, that's like most villains' motives from Final Fantasy, and it's getting a bit old. The world can be okay sometimes, alright? Get some boba, eat a burger, go for a walk, pop the Jergens. If you can get to the end of a video game, one that's touted as unbelievably punishing, and do it your way, with your little patchwork tapestry tale to tuck away in your mind, you can make things work. I love that about the Souls series. They're not all darkness and nihilism. They want to believe in something. The soil is rich here, fertile still in its years. Whether churned by storm or flattened by leather, it blooms. That is the strength I aspire to. But...
Wow, really? You abused the Moonlight Greatsword and the Adjudicator's shield.
What? Who cares? It's all stuff you can find in-game.
I mean, you could have done it naked with a dagger, or learn to parry.
What is this negativity? What are you, some kind of Dark Soul?
I wonder if I still have the fortitude.
And we've only just begun. So, Dark Souls 1, the internet age meme supreme, the founding of a franchise, and the rise of the Get Goodman.
Get good.
It's a unique title in the series, still relevant now. Sales aren't the most important part of discussion, but Demon's Souls capped out around 2 mil on first pass, and though we don't have clear numbers, Dark Souls sold several times that. It's a significant game, the first cross-platform Souls experience, a refined reimagining, and expansion of the design sensibilities and artistic direction conjured by the original. It's kind of a big deal. And it's all those things without changing the basics. You're still a guy, the world is still and you still wander around barren, dying environments while the raggediest things yet conceived pummel you into oblivion. But the name makes it clear, this isn't Demon's Souls. This is the start of something new. And it's hard, like you'd expect. I just kind of reject that framing of the early games in the series. You know what's actually hard? Cooking when you don't want to, okay? Doing your taxes. Waking up at 5 a.m. for minimum wage. I'm just saying. Maybe we can drop the super hardcore gamer pretense. It's just time. It's time. Stop jerking off about how much time you have. It released in 2011, just shy of 2 years after the first. I'm on the PS3 version here. At first I intended to play the original versions of each game to really trace the lineage, but after Blighttown I played whatever was most accessible, and we're in the internet age anyway, the era of post-launch patches. Sekiro and Elden Ring are very different games since release, and that's wild considering how new Elden Ring is. Character creation's nothing special. I played the first. I know the score, but the starting gift selection includes an effective speedrun item, granting access to areas much deadlier than the player is meant to handle far earlier in progression. Nod to the devs, that's some good-ass design. Dark Souls 1 picks up and runs with the base aesthetics of Demon's Souls. The setting is medieval fantasy, but magic feels more normalized. We see it in the opening movie that details the shorthand history of this new setting, the various factions that came together in the world to destroy the dragons with powerful magic, and some words about the accursed dark sign. That's about it. Dark Souls isn't interested in telling you its story. It's extremely interested in letting you figure it out for yourself. I hope you like reading text boxes. What's the dark sign? How does it work? Why does my character look like a zombie at the start of the game? What happened to Gwyn, Nioh, the witch, and Seath? It's a world immediately laced with mystery that goes beyond the original. Demon's Souls said, the world is dying, here's the guy who did it, get really strong. Dark Souls said, world's dying, you'll wake up in a cell. Fair enough. The tutorial stage provides character motivation for nerds, like I needed contextualizing, dude. I love slashing. So this dying guy tells us that hollows, us, I guess, undead people, are destined for greatness or something. Go somewhere. So we do. The one element that stands out about the tutorial is the plunging attack bit, something that wasn't possible before. It's just a falling aerial attack, not super important, which is why I inexplicably messed it up here, but it's good of FromSoft to acknowledge the verticality of their level design and its relevance in combat. The most immediately striking thing about 1, though, is the aesthetic shift, the flavor of the world. Demon's Souls was flat, dingy, very rarely colorful. The colorful bits were the magic, and they often populated later areas.
That is a glowing slug?
Dark Souls, however, gives the player a serene emerald hub watched over by a giant crow. It recreates the unnecessary verticality of the Nexus, adds multiple adjoining areas, places to poke around. There's even optional platforming, but it gives the player no teleportation stones or storage, just a bonfire and the crestfallen guy. I'm gonna get back at FromSoft when I finish up my Dark Souls is garbage and here's why video. Dude, yes, that sounds like a great YouTube video, yeah. So it's still Demon's Souls, only the world is vast, open, interconnected, much more lush and colorful. You have no proper home, only the glow of the bonfire is truly safe. That's not an exaggeration, you can be killed just a short walk away, you know. Dark Souls ain't playing. If you died in the tutorial, you learned an important lesson. Dying doesn't have any meaningful penalty. Immediately. Stats-wise, I mean, no health cuts this time. You progressively turn ugly as sin, but that's immaterial. There are no influencers in this world. And sure, you lose access to multiplayer features until you restore your humanity through a consumable, but nobody's playing PS3 Dark Souls on a weekday, so I journey alone. Otherwise, increased amounts of humanity can provide relatively meaningful benefits, but that's nerdy and doesn't affect the average player experience, so look, the devs even gave the player an upgradable, limited use, refillable healing item, the Estus Flask. Quite literally the glue that holds the combat together, keeping the player moving forward. In short, they banned weed, farming, and force the player to engage at least a little with boss mechanics. Elegant little solution. Okay, Miyazaki, give us a twirl. What's important, though, is the game seems nicer, right? It's patting your forehead, it's caressing your face, but head on up to the first level, Undead Burg, and, well, it's fine, but word of advice, when you travel abroad, go down to the bank and take out some local currency, else you find yourself around in a find-out economy. I actually love the Undead Burg in most level 1s in Souls games. They're usually densely packed castles or city streets, full of considered, playground-esque design. They're just fun. But holy mother, the base enemies in this game hit hard and fast. Enemies in Demon's Souls are lethargic, drained by comparison. See, they knew the player wasn't getting punished for dying anymore, and probably learned a lot about how forgiving basic enemies could be, so they notched everything up and bundled them up. You'll get destroyed screwing around in the Undead Burg. All Bloodborne combat discussion starts with an acknowledgement that Dark Souls could be passive, and way too often for combat to be truly exhilarating. And that's not a meme. It's a behavior taught and rewarded by the game design. You can reveal a lot about the design of something just by asking what the designers reward. And yeah, drawing up a shield and playing passive goes a long way in Dark Souls. In fact, I sat there in stark disbelief about the difficulty of the first big level compared to what Demon's Souls was in some. You know what? All Souls games are bullshit. That's just the truth. They'll throw all kinds of stupid crap at you, but it's usually a matter of dodge rolling in time or swerving fast, basically having a grasp on movement controls to punch through. But the jump to Dark Souls was a jump in pace. The world's inhabitants aren't just picking flowers and doing their chores. They're waiting for you with running shoes, and you're gonna die.
This game! This game!
Sometimes it takes another cup of coffee, or a pig helmet, or going insane. The first time you get Souls games really is the turning point. It's what stops you from tearing up online and getting schmad. For me, years ago, it was Bloodborne, 6 hours in. That's how long it took to make it make sense. Dark Souls 1 took until the bell gargoyles. After upgrading my little longsword as much as I could and minding my surroundings, dodging in rhythm, felling the boss, and gazing out at that hopeful sky, I got it. Normally, I wouldn't bother highlighting something as small as this skybox and play experience because really, who cares? But even a cursory glance at the achievement percentages shows an extremely steep drop-off between simply arriving in Lordran and actually ringing the first bell immediately after killing the gargoyles. The Undead Berg, the Taurus Demon, and the gargoyles combined are a genuine player filter of nearly 20%. I guess it's a trade-off. Rewarding misery means an invested remainder. I want to take a minute to talk builds again. Please forgive me for not doing a full rundown of what each individual stat does. Like intelligence makes your brain big, and faith makes you believe more in God. I was watching a critique of another video game, and the guy had to rattle off what, like, the health stat did and every other one too, and I'm sitting there like, cool. But I played Pokemon at 7 and Dragon Quest at 8. I actually play games? No, you're right, YouTube, man. Someone out there surely doesn't know about hit points. I played every Souls game, so I experimented with something new in every game. At first I wanted a fancy weapon and some powers, but that ended up feeling cheesy with passive health regen and bypassing the enemy's guard option with my sword. It meant I could safely ignore some of the challenging design, turn my brain off, disengage. But this is Dark Souls. Even if the evergreen get good has, in its overuse, become as cliche as an arrow to the knee or any other stale meme, I wanted to get good. I'm reviewing all the games. Of course I want to exhibit at least mild competence, so some commenter dipshit doesn't pop off about how I didn't really complete the game because I didn't run the thing naked 6 times or whatever you weirdos get up to. To be fair, you'll get that response no matter what you do. Some people are broken, and whatever game they're playing is the only thing holding them together. They are not your problem. Their bloodline is weak, and they will not leave a mark on history. Anyway, I thought it'd be real cool to run the whole game with the basic longsword and a shield to parry attacks. A real low-key soldier type. 2 problems. Turns out the basic longsword's actually really good, like Swiss Army knife good. And second, parrying in Dark Souls can burn in hell. Scenario, you're actually trying to complete the game on a schedule. You go to parry anyone and take a hit. You try this 3 times and die. Why would you ever bother parrying? You know what works better than parry 99% of the time? Baiting an attack and punishing. Not a problem. I play Ganondorf. Without exception, by the way, even shielding and punishing is better. There's no risk. The number of times it makes sense to parry over every other option is 0. So it's a style choice for people who don't mind learning the frame data of every single parryable attack in the game, not accounting for things that can't be parried and other jank. You know what? Don't let me start ranting. Demon's Souls had parries too, but it took till Bloodborne to actually onboard the general player base, so I mean, it speaks for itself. Combat in Dark Souls, though, isn't purely reactive, boring, passive, whatever else it gets called. It's also about seizing the moment, being proactive when you need to. That's a common thing people gloss. Yes, you can throw your shield up and strafe around enemies, fishing for backstabs, but you definitely can't do that with every enemy. Yes, you can just stay out of range and move in with your big forward swing to punish, but sometimes the environment is too cramped, dotted with pillars, swarming with enemies. It's not purely passive. Situational awareness is really what makes these games exciting. That the devs need only place an extra enemy here or there, or even something as simple as a pillar in the room to completely warp the dynamic of combat. Hey, maybe they can take a page out of Brawl's notebook and add tripping too. It often plays with vertical segments to add flavor and texture to battle, destructible objects for visual flair, and the occasional ambush. Even floor hazards. Some enemies create poison clouds or breathe other status ailments that force the player out. None of this stuff implies passivity. If anything, it flavors the combat as guerrilla, hit and run, cunning first, damage second. That's important too. I think in a game borrowing so heavily from Western everything, it only makes sense to have combat lionize the player willing to become the Greek hero, right? The one who wins with wit above raw brawn. Most of the early boss fights are like that too. You can trick the Taurus demon off the rampart if you're careful. The gargoyles are hardly as ungable as other solo dudes, and the Capra demon, man, I don't know how you beat that guy without 6 schmoves and chucking an alluring skull to pull the dogs off you. What a shitty fight. I mean, really. And I've been killed by the guys waiting outside the boss room. And I've been killed on the corpse run, erasing all reward for victory. Thinking back on it, lots of the game rewards clever player behavior over raw skill. One of the only genuine level grinding spots in the game asks the player to pull aggro, run back, and crouch to abuse the AI into ledge jumping. And just before Blighttown, there's these crazy strong enemies, like 3 of them, and you can lure them to hilarious falling deaths as well because they're like really hard that early. Man, I wanted to get good, but all I did was get mean. But that's Dark Souls. The game doesn't care if you're having fun. It's actually good and virtuous that I'm ignoring the levels and running straight to the bosses sometimes. The ends justify the means. Like I said in the previous section, you've got to reclaim your playthrough. Whether that means looking stuff up, cheesing bosses, glossing levels, I don't care. You can do what you want with your personal property, and I won't hear another word about it. I will say, Dark Souls doesn't totally sweep the first game. Sure, it's got some brilliant elements. The interconnected world and eventual light fast travel make the player very intimate with the map in a way I'm not with Demon's Souls, but issues arise because of that, like not having any direction, knowing where to go. That makes the world more believable. The player should be allowed to get in over their head, especially early on. But the game branches in some strange ways down the line. It's not clean cut like Demon's Souls, and it leads to a strange tension where if you get stuck on anything at all, you'll wonder if you're even supposed to be where you are. Case in point, Blight Town, or as I like to call it, 5 FPS Town. That's a fun place. I don't know anyone who's questioning this neighborhood. It's a pretty cool place to be. Property tax is cheaper in dirt and the views are amazing. Everybody loves Blight Town. Oh my god. Y'all ever play this game? Remember the first time you got petrified? That was fun, like having your HP fully cut in half forever until you trekked all the way back up to the bell tower and bought the cure at a point in the game with no fast travel. I'm serious, casual Souls fans, just play the original. Imagine getting to the Tomb of Giants having never found a light source. Just playing it raw. Couldn't be me! How about those ghosts everywhere in New Londo that you can't even interact with unless you're cursed yourself, which generally means using a consumable with a time limit to fight them at all. Remember the first time you fell into the bottomless lake pit trying to fight the Hydra? No? Is that just me? Remember the invisible bridges in the crystal cave? Oh, please, Centipede Demon, push me into the lava again by turning. Oh, yes! The whole game feels like it's held together with toothpicks and glue, ready to fall apart in a second. It's kind of crazy how lauded the game is. Demon's Souls is simple, flawed, sure, but solid. Dark Souls is a chaotic f***ing mess. Maybe that's why people like it so much. I certainly don't dislike the game, but I'm remembering why I'm not as jazzed by the thing. Jank is important for Souls, though. You've got to remember what the games represent. In a time where gaming increasingly catered to a mass market and marked everything on your map for you, the Souls game said, here's a guy, go. They had the balls to be subversive in a time of conformity. And even when they stumble and look actually incomplete, I have to sit back and laugh. Turns out you can put whatever in your art. If it were pure and filtered, I wouldn't think anything of it. Wouldn't crack a smile, you know? Line mouth. But this stuff? It's nice to breathe. The game has quality locations, though. I mentioned the Undead Burg for its winding paths and low-key, high difficulty, but Sen's Fortress is just as enjoyable for making the player pay attention. Take the environment and the enemies into account instead of blazing through carelessly. Starting in the darkness and ending with a gorgeous view and raw sunlight makes it one of the few high-emotion environments of the game as well. There really is something magical about the first game, and using simple sunlight to reward the player. A skybox, a picture. The forest areas are inoffensive despite trees obfuscating combat somewhat. They're a welcome distraction from the death and decay of the many other biomes, and the Grand Archives makes use of vast vertical space and structure to create a challenge unlike anything else in the game. For every place I dislike, there's a genuinely enjoyable one. The best, though, sitting at a 50% view rate for the general player base, yikes, is Anor Londo. The Souls games all care about views, maybe because they like making the player feel small, or part of something greater. Maybe Miyazaki just loves picturesque visuals. I don't know, but Anor Londo is the original Dark Souls holy shit view. Incidentally, it uncaps the uncanny vibe the games are so fond of. I mean, really, you just blasted through undead shithole, fantasy forest, the sewers, the double sewers, hell, some other places, and then you reach a real city, basked in an eternally setting sun. The guards are giants, totally still unless you step too close. It's mostly empty. It's impossible to not respect the art direction, conveying that something is wrong with negative space, the lack of motion, the unanswered mystery. Arguably more than Demon's Souls, the levels of Dark Souls tell stories directly related to their end bosses. Without ever reading a text document, we see piles of tortured souls in a jail connected to the Grand Archives, the site of Seath the Scaleless' life work. research on immortality. We descend down into Blighttown, a city buried underneath another, and descend further into the Demon Ruins, another civilization shoved deep into the earth with the Witch of Izalith and her children. The great weight of history imbuing the area makes it truly alien in a world you previously felt you understood. The sheer depth of the catacombs leading into the Tomb of the Giants, the absolute downward momentum leading to Gravelord Nito's final chamber really drives home the point that the world is ancient, war-torn, and violent, that life demands death. What stands now stands atop an eon of loss. For all those words and feelings, nothing really topped Anor Londo and Princess Guinevere. After a long journey and a tough boss against two opponents, you open a door to reveal this sun-dappled giant woman. It's ethereal, hard to describe, facing something that feels truly warm and meaningful, even godly, which only makes it more brutal that everything, Anor Londo's splendor, is a farce. Like I mentioned, Dark Souls is often called depressing, and not for no reason. The world is decaying, literally clinging to fading embers for any semblance of normalcy. The old powers clutch to what they have, even if it means becoming twisted, vile shells of their former selves, blind and mad, even propping up a false image of former power, posturing still at the end of the world. This game is from 2011. How does it feel like it's parodying the end of our actual Earth? That's not an exaggeration either. The world is scummy and parodies ours accurately. The painted world of Ariamis is an optional level tucked away in an Anor Londo painting. It's full of grotesque, awful enemies, and even the fouling slimes from Demon Souls. Because God, ew. And the final boss of the area doesn't even want to fight. She's a half-breed dragon person who escaped into this bleak nightmare world because it was the only place she could find solace in a cruel, judgmental reality. Do you see why people like these games with a little digging? Miyazaki, come on! Now I beat these games consecutively, so I like to think I'm able to compare them pretty well. People asked me, how'd you beat them so fast? Listen up. I grab my long sword and roll up like the fucking Terminator. I'm a vendor of damage, son. I'm slinging strings with my steel swings. I'm lyrically superior, and I looked up boss strats when I needed help. I found the bosses of Dark Souls 1 way more annoying overall compared to Demon Souls, whose bosses ranged from pushovers to puzzles to punch-outs. Very few bosses are free. The moth is stupid, actually just flies down and exposes itself to you, but if you dodge wrong, it'll kill you. Pinwheel isn't difficult, and even the Gaping Dragon is just a movement mastery check if we're being honest, and you can kinda just hang behind Seath and beat him to death, but many more bosses are outright Flame Lurker level all over again. Sif, for example, having a series of moves that must be respected or you're getting fixed. Ornstein and Smo, possibly the greatest player filter in the game, requires you to play smart around pillars and focus down one while the other beats on you, and then finish off the powered up other that you didn't kill. Quelaag can piss off, man. What the hell was that all about? Every player's run will be different, and I'm sure a stock Pyromancer build eats half the bosses alive, but I still think it's good that the bosses are designed like this. It means some go down without popping a player blood vessel, and others feel super rewarding. Not every guy needs to be memorable, you know? Shoot, a ton of the bosses are straight up not required to complete the game. That's wild. I love that. It's perfect for an open, freely explored game about immersing into the world. There might be something crazy around the corner, and some players might never know. Unfortunately, Seath was a pushover, and he's one of the big deal people left alive in the world. How about the others? The Witch of Izalith is perhaps the worst boss in the series, just for being so frustrating to kill. You aren't dying to normal damage, okay? It's...
Oh, what?
And then sometimes it's...
Oh my god!
It's a fight so bad that the devs made any damage permanent. You don't need to start the fight from scratch when you re-enter. I mean, at least they admit it. Nioh, any boss that's a boss with at least 10 minions probably isn't getting a pass from me. In fact, Nioh made me give up on my basic soldier LARP to don the ridiculously powerful Havel's armor so I could tank through all his hits and slap him to death. Havel's. Feels awful, but it works. So they left it to the final boss for the heavy lifting. Story time. The story you're not given, but left to piece together with context clues and text boxes on items, and even that's not enough for some characters, is about the world ending. The first flame, a primordial fire that literally created life and death by existing, spawned a series of powerful souls that were taken hold of by those story characters we just put down. They subjugated the dragons, and the Age of Fire began, but as time passed, the fire faded, and the lords grew weak and wary. All things die. Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, sacrificed himself to stoke the flames again, and the Second Age of Fire is where our character enters the plot. Mankind is dead and gone because most of mankind is cursed with undeath, perpetually dying and being resurrected until they've degenerated into total insanity. It's why death zombifies you, why consuming humanity cures you, why humanity can be used to stoke bonfires and provide more Estus. Humanity is precious, a remnant of hope, a reminder of a greater age, when humans were worthwhile. But again, all things end, and humanity is in limited supply. Literally too, the consumable is actually limited in-game. Regardless of plot events, the lore of Dark Souls is deeply melancholic and moving. The characters you meet, no matter how bright and armored, tend to find only despair and loneliness. Even the final boss, Gwyn, the fated Lord of Sunlight, supposedly sacrificed but still clinging to existence, isn't given some bombastic theme, but the strongest piece in the OST. As you battle to death with the last vestige of a bygone era, deep in the kiln of the first flame. Seriously, what is this track? Who? Motoi Sakuraba, composer for Golden Sun, we meet again! Fucking plot ass. I should have known it was you! And you're denied a meaningful ending, whether you listen to Frampt or Kath, the disgusting wriggling hell serpents who are pushing for a new age, either a new Age of Fire or Age of Darkness. They're both bad outcomes. Yes, the Age of Fire, again, is technically okay, but it's like living for 90 years and resetting to zero, so forcing the world through another cycle of unrest. It's just another shot in a universe that won't do any better this time. And an Age of Darkness means the fire fades. Humans will live without humanity, free of the gods, but not aspiring to anything meaningful. Yeesh. Dark Souls 1 is a brain-blasting nightmare hell experience, ranging from peaceful to deeply, utterly unhinged. The design feels experimental in a way even the prototype didn't, but it's truly memorable because of that, and among Souls games, it may well command the most raw pathos. The number of times I actually felt something was never matched again, at least in the mainline games. I'm serious, usually when I play games, I feel dead, so well, anyway, the lone DLC caps the game off well. In a world so thoroughly preoccupied with past empires and ancient lords, it only makes sense to travel back yourself. Artorias, the legendary knight who you learned about mid-game, is losing control of his humanity to the abyss. The actual environment isn't much to talk about, it's further from the fall. Still lush, foreshadowing the events of the main game. The real draw of the DLC is the Artorias boss fight. Manus as well, but we'll get there. Artorias is the prototype for the future of Souls games. This is the original Slave Knight Gale. This is where boss design was headed. It's a fight that completely contradicts the design of the game writ large, where most bosses made use of their environments in some way, either by demanding spatial control or spatial awareness. Artorias uses a flat, clear coliseum, where most bosses are doable even with poor understanding of their movesets. Artorias demands the player understand his to within 60-70% accuracy. He's fast, highly lethal, and constantly moving around. The battle doesn't take place in the Coliseum as much as within the range of your dodge roll. There isn't much room for error. The Artorias fight only happens because of Manus, however. Once again, the player travels through a dead empire and down the black abyss to face its creator, the primordial human that ends up mostly important to the sequel, weirdly enough. Manus gives a little more room for error, but tacks on significant ranged options and extreme damage. He's just about as frustrating as Artorias for different reasons. He's also important to Souls boss design, where Artorias is razor sharp, but still largely telegraphed and fair. Manus deals obscene damage for even a single mistake, but offers a lot more wiggle room between the various rocks to hide behind, and openings he leaves for the player. He feels a lot like your average large-scale Elden Ring boss, that is, tall enough that he obfuscates his own attacks, and magical enough that it's frustrating to learn the fight for a raw melee character. Shattering Manus' soul closes Dark Souls for good, and those shards would seed the lore for Dark Souls 2. The sequel's controversial for a lot of reasons, mostly owing to a director swap, an ad campaign, and a change of vision, but change is necessary for growth and perspective. Regardless of the outcome, it's a fascinating point of comparison for the other games. Long ago, I was afraid of difficult things. When it rained, I would run inside. When the sun shone too bright, I sought the shade. But in those days, I was only a child, and there was so much work to do.
Oh, I can't wait to read the comments on this one.
Would you Why anyway? What's the big deal?
Haven't you heard? This is the worst Dark Souls game and secretly genius.
I don't have time for this crap. Just play the thing and be honest. That's the rule.
That's hardly manipulative enough to be a story fit for YouTube.
Okay, Dark Souls 2. Call this the guillotine because it's good at dividing people. Seriously, it's like a faction of gigabrains that love it most. Flawless analogy. Now here at the KBash show, we don't engage in fan partisanship or any of that stuff, except all those times I did. So for the straight dope, you came to the right place. I had a big ol' arc with this one, more than the other games actually. Game started hot, burned for a while, fell off, exploded. I can definitively tell you that Dark Souls the Squeakquel is a video game you can play for fun sometimes. But it's best to go in expecting nothing. Most of the criticism is overblown, and a lot of the praise feels like slight contrarianism, and I can respect that. I've been both those people. Alas, the ever-evolving nature of the discourse TM. Dark Souls 2 reminds me of the DM, who just finished their first completely homebrewed open-world campaign. It was messy, but even though the DM's friends had fun, the DM only remembers the stuff that went wrong. How that dungeon was too long and mostly unnecessary. How the party just went in a totally unexpected direction towards unprepared content. How the goals were defined, but direction was lacking. So for Campaign 2, they bust out the pre-written module. Surely this time will be better. Right? Seriously, that's how map design went moving forward. You can stick it on a chart. The game released in 2011, directed not by Miyazaki, but Tomohiro Shibuya and Yui Tanimura. The shift in design sensibilities is largely attributed to the new directors, but it's worth noting that Dark Souls had the cultural pull and the wiggle room to expand and experiment. It's probably only good that DS2 ended up like it did, even if the product is strange in its own ways. Now, I'm on Scholar of the First Sin Edition, the remaster for PS4, mostly because y'all ain't catch me running another Blight Town, and I think it skewed my view a bit. Clean 60 FPS, enhanced visuals, trouser tear-inducing skyboxes, the game looks good, for at least 3 or 4 levels. It opens with the few crumbs every Souls game gives you. You're a cursed undead, doomed to lose your sanity in time. There's a place you need to go and something you need to do, but some interesting language is used here. The narrator directly invokes fate, that you're fated to do the thing and burn up, more or less describing the last game. I guess the reality of the universe is ever-ending empires buried under each new layer of ash, repeating ad nauseum. That's fun. Makes sense, though, between either of one's endings, birthing another Age of Flame or entering into an Age of Darkness. It's hard to see anything definitive or meaningful in the previous conclusion. Now we're stuck in that uncertainty, unless we can break the chain of fate. Oh, let's go! I love breaking fate in games. I was fated to be an unmotivated background character, but here I am, talking to the mic for free. Okay, I'll stop. And part of breaking fate with this game, for me, was being told how allegedly awful it was up front. I assumed it was the worst thing ever, and to be fair, I don't know how to rank it, but let's take a look. I took pains to claim my playthrough early, as it were. I browsed builds and spoiled all the armor sets and went with a basic hexer. That means dark magic because it's badass. A mix of intelligence and faith and a whole lot of everything else. Build eats souls for breakfast. Stat points, I mean. It's fairly unwieldy. But I wanted to play my little dark magic caster, so damn it, I went out and got it. And it owned. Hold up. Perfect. Once assembled, it tore through the early game, sent countless bosses to the Shadow Realm on first pass. I loved Dark Souls 2, and why wouldn't I? I could keep enemies at bay with a little kiting and pummel them with dark orbs. I could lure a group and crowd control with scraps of life and Darkstorm. I could swap to my trashy hand axe when I ran low on spells, buff my weapon with dark magic, and debuff the enemy's defense. And since I was building Faith, I could use healing magic if I really needed it. The build was amazing. Hard carried the playthrough until the DLC, and sometimes mage builds suffer in these games with hard to replenish spell uses. I can't imagine running a pure caster in the last game with so few bonfires. I mean, I'm sure it's possible, but it's not like they make it easy. That's actually one of the major changes across entries too, littered the map with checkpoints, and you can fast travel to all of them. This is one of the common points of contention. Propped up in a vacuum is bad design, but the purpose of minimal bonfires in the first game was strong-arming the player, aka rewarding the player, for charting the world and digging for treasure. It was a map that was linked straight through, so the player needed to understand the terrain. DS2 has no such world, so it needs no such checkpoint design. It's a linear game. It's almost never a question of where to go, but rather What do I need? What key opens the next place, and where is that? Because most of the levels lead directly into one another, with a few deviating paths. Like a tree branch! I think that burned a lot of people on release. Like, really? This is what you're following that game up with? But time's been kind to Dark Souls 2. You don't need to make the same game twice. That one's still there. Still good. Still like 40 hours, Jesus. Try something new, and if you hate it, the studio will come around eventually. One thing that stood out here is NPCs and the general sense of community. You find all kinds of strange people throughout the game, either hanging around or trapped in stone, and most of them end up back in Majula. It somehow feels more whimsical than one. You know, the talking cat. The weird blacksmith. Okay, they've all been weird. Maybe it's the eternally setting sun making NPCs feel warmer. Because they tend to keep with the Souls tradition, like helping Lucatiel here and getting her help later on. Oh shit, they even got the crestfallen guy! Have you noticed how high this place is? How long do you think it'd take to hit the rocks? Okay, I'm calling the cops! On that note, let's talk about the good before getting weird. Design shifted all over the place. Game's like a chameleon, and part of that was designer expectations for the player. Healing yourself in this game is different than both of the previous games. Couldn't settle for greatness. Literally ever, it looks like. The Estus Flask is back, but heals you gradually after a short rev up, so no shooting to full in a second. You gotta plan that Second, you can stock up on life gems, another heal over time consumable. So grass, but worse. I like having more options though. The game's hard enough at times. Still, swapping band-aids for prescriptions, that makes it sound terrible. I've been scrubbing the footage here, trying to figure out exactly what Dark Souls asks of the player in combat. And everything I've said before, you know, patience, reactivity, seizing crucial moments, guerrilla-style play, that's all highly rewarded, but you're often only fighting single strong enemies, multiple weak enemies on occasion, or made to break groups up using the level design. Dark Souls 2 features a lot more enemies than you'd fight on average in one, and certainly in Demon Souls. So you're still playing guerrilla style, regardless of your build, but you're more often punished for zeroing in on a single enemy. I actually like that a lot. The lock-on feature is nice, but it's a crutch. It actively makes several boss fights throughout the series harder. It's almost like 2 was reacting to that weakness of the earlier Souls games. Like, yeah, cameras are hard and lock-on makes it worse sometimes, so trust the space, trust your instincts. You've got object permanence, so use it. It's hitting the same notes, but curing a bad habit. I learned about switching lock-on off in Bloodborne years ago, and thank God I did, because whew, you don't want to lock on much in 2. It's not just basic enemies. Many bosses aren't big dudes at all, contrary to the "it's all armored dudes" meme. No, you fight multiple swarms of little guys constantly. The skeleton lords demand the player run, hide behind pillars, take each lord out one at a time. The belfry gargoyles basically parody the old bell tower gargoyles, but give you 5 total opponents. Good God. I love the ruined sentinels for making use of divide and conquer tactics, having the player take out one above, then escaping below as another jumps up to quickly dispatch the other. The royal rat vanguard is literally just rats, and lots of them, but only one has the boss health bar. Still locking on? Have fun on break. How about the twin dragon riders that basically demand you keep unlocked, or at least locked onto the ground guy and reacting to the archer via audio cues? He's not even visible for most of the fight. That's a crazy amount of trust to put in the player. And yes, even more fights follow this pattern, so it's obvious. The devs are testing the player to play in a new way. It's not that Dark Souls 2 is poo-poo garbage, it's just challenging old players differently. Well, so there is this one little thing. It's just the dodging doesn't work right. Look, I'm sorry. DS2 apologists, your game is fun most of the time, but the game has a bad rap for a reason, more than just uncharitable discourse. The hitboxes are straight schwacked. Just gonna say it. Let's take a look. Oh, taking notes from Lords of Shadow, huh? And worse than those, and there are many of those, the efficacy of the dodge roll is suspect because it's directly affected by 2 factors. Rather than just weight impacting your roll, you also need to invest in the adaptability stat, which buffs a substat called agility that any Dark Souls player from the old days probably isn't getting invested in because they're looking for a damage stat, health, endurance, and damage stat too. Agility isn't super enticing at a glance, but it turns out it directly increases the iframes, the invincibility, the core value of the Souls roll. That's actually just insane. Maybe it's a secret good thing that only highly agility-invested players can use the most basic damage mitigation mechanic. I think it's an attempt to give cloak and dagger players a stronger niche than just being armed worse on average, and I'm really glad that there's stat point respecs this time, but literally almost vomited. And the mechanics are a little wonky. I didn't feel it right away, but something is genuinely sluggish and weird about the combat. I noticed after totally respecking into a melee build for the DLC. Maybe it's the 60 FPS or the slightly smooth movement, but still stiff Dark Souls attacks with their endless recovery frames. Maybe it's that enemies don't seem to react as viscerally to attacks. Whatever it is, alongside rolling, thing feels weird. Now you can still play it just about the same, throwing a shield up and strafing for backstabs. Shoot, I did it with my greasy Hex Hermit for half the game, so it's not this dramatic undoing of everything Souls was. It's fine. And to the devs' credit, the level design, though linear, still hits the same notes. You're still doing light platforming to find treasure, and being made to contextualize combat through the lens of whatever hazards are present, from pillars to corridors. Light itself is used far more consistently than previous titles with this little torch system, basically permanently lighting sconces if you take the time. In the old games, you got Tomb of the Giants and a few other spaces, but DS2 has the Gutter, a level you're made to light up yourself entirely. Multiple rooms in regular levels lack light, but do not lack enemies. It's a dangerous game to run through, arguably more lethal than the first. It's actually wild seeing old reactions to the trailers and director interviews. Like, Buddy said he wanted to make the game more accessible and proceeded to gate dodge rolling usefulness behind a mediocre combat stat. Mao. Dark Souls 2 is playable and several bosses are easier than some of the nonsense in 1, but it's plenty hard on its own. Speaking of which, what a good level, you guys. Several levels are just nonsense. DS1 had all kinds of problem areas, alright? Blight Town, the entire tree segment right by Blight Town, the sewers leading to Blight Town. Starting to think this place is a tumor. DS2, on the other hand, has this entire watery strip, the Shrine of Amana, that's designed so tightly with projectile jackasses dealing piles of damage, swarms of guys digging into Uranus, unseeable death drops. Really great vacation location. Check it out. The Gutter is bad, but the Black Gulch is awful. I don't know why you'd recreate the misery of Blight Town and then force the player to march into actual hell. And then hide some really important stuff under the gulch with a jump I don't know how you make without a guide. You know, really shooting for excellence here. Most of the areas aren't bad, but the few that are really stand out. Linear design is interesting because you can account for the player's route and tailor it just so, and have it challenge a range of builds and weapons. And don't worry, I couldn't forget the Black Fortress, even if I tried. This piece of shit is probably the flat worst in the game. Highly aggressive, highly armored enemy groups with plenty of range support and a web of perilous walkways make it genuinely miserable to navigate. Even when you think you got the hang of the place, it whips out some pins for your fingernails, just like for fun, I guess. And enemies stop respawning if you kill them 12 times. Okay, cool, but seriously, making it harder to run through the levels with highly cropped and manicured difficulty is basically contrary to the Souls series design ethos, and enemy despawns is in fact a design concession. Anyone who tells you DS2 is too casual might be legally insane. It rewards strength builds fairly well, hexers most of the time, blunt weapons in general. Each Souls game has a few blind spots and nigh omni-useful tools, but this game is ready and waiting to kick your ass. It's not even nice about it, like the walk into Blight Town and the luring enemy trick. And this is the easy version. I have to stress that I'm playing the easier, gutted version of the game. I don't even want to know what the hell's going on in vanilla. One thing I've ignored since DS1 is the Covenant system. A player will likely gain access to Covenants first via Guinevere and Anor Londo. It was mostly a multiplayer thing, but the point is you'd farm up some collectibles via assisting players or killing them, or whatever else the Covenant asked, and turn them in for light rewards. It was a fairly opaque system on first pass, and DS2 actually puts them in your face sooner, more frequently. It feels plausible to interact with many. You don't need to scour and hunt to engage with a gameplay feature. And it's a cool idea. Ropes players into the world a bit, makes them feel like they belong somewhere. But every system in Dark Souls that isn't combat or directly related to increasing player damage, so smithing is mostly ignorable otherwise, and some are even looked down on at times. Some very serious people take offense to others beating the game via multiplayer, which is fascinating because it's a multiplayer game, and hey, in 3 at least, the devs are real deliberate about removing multiplayer options for certain climactic fights. Right, not every fight matters that much, so why is the AI partner system, a system present since Demon's Souls and dedicated to assisting a troubled player that also touches on themes of connectivity and trust, hope at the end of the world, how is that system despised by the broader base? If you're stuck, and generally if you've completed at least part of a character's side quest as well, you can summon an NPC before several boss battles. Crucially, not every boss has a summon, but most do. I'll admit, after playing through 2 games, I was getting tired and I summoned the rare time to make a problem go away and to generally comment on the system. It made this fight in particular a breeze, and that's really the danger and the strength. Nobody loses anything using a summon to win except the player, and the player gets to decide if they lost. And hey, not all builds are equally compatible with all bosses. I think it's a smart failsafe system to keep a playthrough lubricated. Alternatively, they can do this.
What? He fell
Falling
in!
to your death before ever hitting the boss room. I'd scream if I weren't dying inside. The people who get mad about summons ultimately are the same people who'd be furious if a young person's student loans were forgiven. The people who do every single thing by the book and expect everyone else to do the same. The people who wouldn't take a day off work for a funeral or wedding. The people who can't imagine other people and their differing needs and interests. In short, people you don't need to worry about. Their bloodlines are weak and they will not leave their mark on history. Otherwise, there isn't much going on with the base game's bosses. I like the multi-battles for novelty's sake, but most of the others feel like retreads. Some of them literally are retreads, like that's Ornstein on screen. And very few ask the player to do new things, mechanically speaking. It's still about blocking, rolling, and running, watching, waiting, and reacting. Like, why comment on all of them if they all go down just about the same? Fire off enough dark blasts, and these dudes blend into a slurry. It's nuts. I'm kind of taken aback by how this all fits together in the tapestry of Souls design. Experimentation, diverging from the path is healthy, but we're left with a game that casts off a lot of Demon's Souls' ease of play. Aside from the addition of fast travel, abandons the complex and intriguing map design of 1 for a linear experience that's surprisingly brutal. And really, I'm not sure who's supposed to be jazzed by that. Someone who really likes inching through trap-ridden dungeons tile by tile, I guess? Y'all played back during Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, huh? Bought yourself a 10-foot pole? Seriously, one of the strengths, one of the great accessibility options of Souls games, historically, is allowing the player choice in ignoring the environment and enemy placements and running straight to the boss. I'm playing through Elden Ring right now. All the way to the latest game, FromSoft encourages that kind of behavior. And why wouldn't they? The levels are often more frustrating than the bosses, at least the pre-Sekiro games. You don't even need to backtrack in Elden Ring. You can just warp between checkpoints once they're unlocked. Same for Dark Souls 3, so why in 2 are several levels designed to resist the run? Ultimately, it's probably because the designers thought this is a linear experience. It should be cropped so the player has to work for the win. But it won't be impossible. They're not backtracking anymore, so there's no need to make level traversal trivial. We can fine-tune it to force engagement. Do you see the issue in that, though? For a game supposedly being made with accessibility in mind, many of its levels actively resist the ultimate in player accessibility. The boss run, the guerrilla play conceit. I kinda hate that. Dark Souls 2 is not a bad game, but it's a very specific experience that will clash with player expectations coming off earlier titles. There's no avoiding it. Oh, and the DLC is possible. This is the first game, the only game in the entire set that made me put the thing down and come back weeks later. Sekiro was a personal cross that I got up and dealt with. The 3 DLCs are so hard it's obscene, highlighting everything bad about linear Souls design with its ridiculous stat requirements, highly tuned encounters, multiplayer focus for at least one segment of each, rendering them hopelessly difficult for solo players, and ball-busting boss design. If I put the game down having never touched these, I would have gone ahead saying that 2 was actually really enjoyable, but between respecs to figure out what was wrong with my build, trying to play honestly, trying to play dishonestly, I lost so much faith in the game's systems. And that's not a condemnation of the rest, right? The non-DLC DS2 journey is fine and playable, but this stuff can chew gravel.
Okay, I'm sorry, what?
Things are going well. As you can see, I'm characterizing the DLCs to make a point, but let's review some facts. I held off on them till after every other game was recorded. That's how hard I bounced. But after respecing into adaptability, the dodge roll stat, dexterity, etc., I ended up dual-wielding basic longswords because they are my sole weapon, and infused them with lightning. I proceeded to brute force my way through every DLC level, every obnoxious boss, and felt genuine happiness after completing it. Like, I don't feel that stuff very much anymore. Hardly did with Sekiro. Hardly did with Elden Ring. But this particular achievement, whether because the Burnt Ivory King was extremely difficult, the Fume Knight's damage was totally absurd, and Surlon could clip me with a hitbox bigger in Texas with his stabbing move, I don't know, it felt good. Like, finally, I can take a break. Shulva has all these Indiana Jones-ass segments, tricks and traps, stone pressure plate stuff. It's surprisingly fun. Like, the level of playfulness in the design is super endearing. Ilium Lois is a sharp, extremely punishing area, but it's the first to reward the player for fully exploring the environment. That's not insignificant, even if it runs counter to the design of other Souls games. It also houses the single worst multiplayer area yet designed. Broom Tower makes use of vertical level design that gives it a nice oaky texture. It's just fun design. What do you want from me? Yes, the levels are frustrating, and yes, I've been finding gray hairs. Such is life, okay? All told, I don't agree with the damage on the Fume Knight because he's super simple to fight. Just dodge every attack. If you take 2 hits without healing, you're dead. And he's programmed to run at you if he catches you healing, so the trick is baiting him into an animation, usually by rolling behind him to heal up. 7.5 out of 10, purely adequate fight. So the Souls games, and arguably most in DS2, push intense challenges onto the player, and sometimes it pays off. I bet this entry specifically gives the highest high, and specifically because the level of challenge, how crafted the challenge can be, is ambrosially evil. So thumbs up for being evil. In case you weren't sold on my bit about the linearity of DS2 also creating a lot of feels bads through forced engagement scenarios, the DLCs all double down on the idea, making the player stop and do chores until some battle is finished, some action completed, some item scrounged and placed in a slot. Demon's Souls had subversive design when it hit store shelves. Very rarely did you require a key to get somewhere. Even if some doors were locked, many were circlable or circumventable, and few locked doors were necessary for progression, instead hiding powerful secret items. Dark Souls 2 makes a point of reining the player in, demanding certain behaviors. It doesn't reward cunning, but rather adherence, and that's wild considering the narrative. I love jerking off about ludonarrative harmonies these days when the gameplay and the narrative are telling the same story, helping each other out. I believe this is referred to as frauding, but the entire point of the second game here is to break fate. Wild then that you're constrained by the level design, forced to jump through hoops, and generally thwarted by specific enemies and bosses if you're on a specifically under-supported build. The game that should care, maybe the most about player sovereignty, hardly does. And you can drop a counterpoint here, it's all subjective. Maybe the point is really to hammer home how difficult breaking fate is, how the game itself confines the player to shackles they must genuinely struggle to break. And there's beauty in that idea too, just not as much fun to play through. Whereas a game designed to allow the player all the things Souls games traditionally do would preserve the fun while producing narratively mimetic gameplay, or gameplay that mirrors the idea of breaking fate. Well, anyway, here's the ending. Provided you don't do a few extra things like talking to a bonfire ambush person several times and killing an old man, eventually you hunt down one of the sisters born of the Shards of Manus, who's the real villain of the story, having tricked a kingdom into its own downfall. She dies and you get in the tomb, taking your place in the Great Cycle. Or you can leave and allow the flame to burn out and become the Dark Lord. None of these endings break fate. You either perpetuate the cycle or allow the Age of Darkness to begin. Just like the last game, you either allow humanity to linger on and cling desperately to hope with an inevitable end, or let it go peacefully. Boo. Or, having done all that funny stuff, you now have the blessing of the old king, granting a crown that allows the player to retain their humanity and live agelessly. No longer a part of this cycle. So in choosing not to sacrifice yourself, you become an ageless entity, greater than the world, an S-tier individual, someone who genuinely earned what they got. That's a more fitting end to 2 than I can imagine, handing the player an actual kingly reward for sticking it out and pulling through, casting off the yoke of fate. Still bleak for the rest of of the world, but 2 is easily the weakest of the group in my mind. I figure a player who really likes a stiff challenge or a particular build from this game will like it best. Maybe a story or lore buff might dig into the world and characters and gameplay enough to put it above demons. Who knows? And really, if you were off-put by the aesthetics of 1, particularly the bosses everyone loves, I can see liking 2 as the hipster pick. Look guys, all I'm saying is Nights in the Nightmare is super fun and cool. It just takes an hour of tutorials and 30 hours of guided practice. Where'd everyone go?
Is it possible that the sun I ran away from only shone so bright to bring me warmth, and that in my endless running, spurn the light and courted shadow?
Okay, you need to know some things about Dark Souls 3. If you use a bleed build, you're bad. If you use Sellsword Twin Blades, you're bad. If you don't parry, you're bad. If you go Pyromancy, you're bad. If you poison... Why would shooting a spirit work?
Because it always works in these things. It always works!
This one's kind of a homecoming for me. Bloodborne may have been my first Souls experience, but Dark Souls 3 was my first Dark Souls. I remember hearing how different it'd be, how being slow and reactive mattered, how I should really get a shield and throw it up. So naturally I went Dex Int because the Ice Scythe weapon looked cool, and even though it was an endgame weapon, I could probably get there quick enough. It was probably the hardest game I'd ever played at that point, right up there with vanilla PS2 Devil May Cry 3, and I never finished it properly. Dark Souls is thought of as difficult, and it is, but it universally demands a set of skills that Bloodborne didn't really teach. I'm happy to say that playing Demons through 2 paid off with interest. This entry takes place in the same world, a very tired world in need of a proper finale. Let's be real, neither 1 nor 2 get definitive ends, or even meaningful world progression. The world is either reset or ended, the eternal edge, the cosmic cock cage. Dark Souls 3 expands the lore enough to account for a new protagonist, one who's mostly incapable of putting things to rest. The Ashen One, an ancient undead warrior like the protags of past games, has a particular role to play. They once failed to become a Lord of Cinder, rendering them unkindled. That means, in shorthand, that they weren't as useful to the First Flame as the Lords of Cinder, so benchwarm ad nauseum until the fire is threatened and they're drawn to link the flame. Wait a minute. This is just like any other game, isn't it? You're just a guy with bad chances and you're gonna be presented with linking the flame again or letting the fire die again. How? I'll get into the story later, but I'm impressed with how repetitious it is. You gotta respect someone who commits to the bit. It's not that the Souls games and their stories are bad, on the contrary. Many characters and bosses have compelling backstories and really interesting lore to dig up, giving the player a chance to examine lives lived in basically hell. It's just that the actual events, taken in macro view, aren't super compelling. In fact, the game pulls aesthetic sleight of hand to cast an old experience in a new coat of paint. Your guy doesn't appear human or zombie-like. They're laced with fading flames. You trudge through cityscapes and poison swamps and unholy beautiful locales, but not much is actually different. The visuals are often more colorful and the lighting's stark, but the levels still feel like other Souls games. Though I really enjoy Dark Souls 3 and would play it again, if only for its modern opulence and mechanics, it's not an exceptionally unique experience. Sandwiched between Bloodborne and Sekiro and ultimately swallowed by Elden Ring, it feels intentional, a final nod before tossing the match. Fan reception was fairly mixed. Setting aside the early hype and YouTube content factory, people wrote things like Miyazaki's run out of ideas and worst Souls game for various reasons, which is weird to me because this game seems like a publisher concession. Like, yeah, Souls can make a lot of money, 1 did amazing and 2 got some pushback, so go make us a trillion and you can make all the stupid spin-offs you want. I'm imagining the scenario here, but it doesn't seem far off given everything. And I don't want to start this review negative, so let's talk about something positive. Depending on your rig, DS3 can hit a clean 60 FPS, and the game is stunning. The first all-round incredible visual set from this series. Souls was always good at framing beauty, like several shots could be taken from a romantic-era textbook on the picturesque, but 3 in particular makes use of sharp light, heavy shadow, stoic architecture, strewn details, generally high fidelity in symphony. Things often look bleak on the ground, but hope shines from the sky. It's an unreal visual feast I would recommend purely for aesthetic. I don't do that often, maybe with like Legend of Mana and a few others. And at least for longtime fans, the game should feel super familiar. Compared to the stiff fluidity of 2, an oxymoron for sure, but true in practice, 3 feels just like 1. It's such an incredible feeling picking up a longsword again and thinking, yeah, I could probably kill God with this shit. That's the value, for me, a new aesthetic experience mixed with the gameplay I love. It's not a total return to form, however, DS1 is a weird game, and it holds the title for most bizarre puzzle box world yet conceived among Souls games. 3 borrows heavily from 2, so the game's route is mostly linear with a few branching paths that turn into dead ends. To compensate, not every level is contiguous with only the prior and preceding zones, and the levels themselves have twists and turns, multiple paths the player can choose to go down, with secret ways and shortcuts seeded throughout. Like, yes, the poison swamp sucks. We all hate poison swamps, and if you don't, you're a Miyazaki plant, off with your fingernails. But the swamp in general can be approached in multiple ways, left, right, or center. There's something generally in every direction. And that's the fun, really. You can climb a ladder onto this gorgeous bridge with an immaculate view of the surrounding landscape, and fight a demon straight from the first game. You can wander through the level until you're ganked by 3 strange, gibbering freaks. Who cares? And that's off the beaten path. There's still the level's boss to contend with. The other swamp has a pool with a giant crab you could fight on through, or travel to the right or left and end up fighting a boss far away from what you probably assume is the expected route. I don't think the levels of Dark Souls 3 get enough credit for how layered and how complex they can individually be. Where 2 generally felt like a straight path through some hot nonsense, 1 was also that most of the time, only it was young and felt slightly looser, like you were expected to go a certain way, but you could handle it a few ways. 3 constantly throws opulent, multi-level environments at the player with a single ultimate goal, but plenty of ways to get lost. Think of the monastery grounds in general, how sprawling and tiered that level is, or the early game village and its own wends and ways the player can take to reach the boss, or the side content attached to the level. I think it's unfair to frame the game as bad or lazy when it's mostly hitting the same notes as other games. The game also borrows the bonfire system from 2, so frequent checkpoints that can be freely fast-traveled between. I've heard these suck on occasion, but aside from making the game more enjoyable for me and encouraging the player to explore nooks and crannies, regardless of how many warp points exist, all bonfires really do is serve to give the player more breaks and buff magic builds by making MP more easily refilled. I don't think that's a crime, and it's not super difficult to notch the encounter intensity by adding more enemies, more obnoxious enemies, etc. Still, 3 feels like this weird baby produced by the shrieking miserable coitus between 1 and 2, and the baby inherited a lot of the traits from the parent everyone thinks is a bore. Regardless, those traits pay off specifically toward what the game ends up pushing. When you think of Dark Souls 3 and its unique additions, what comes to mind first? The only thing I can think of that affects regular play is the skill system. Every weapon has a skill or weapon art ranging from low-key stanced-up slash attacks, spins, sometimes really acrobatic flourishy stuff, and several legendary and magical weapons get flashy and beautifully animated skills unique to them. And these skills end up being the worth of Dark Souls 3, why I like the game so much, why I don't get people who don't. To me, Souls games have always been about the build. It's the thing you can immediately share and compare with other players. It's the first talking point. How'd you beat X, Y, or Z? And Souls games are pretty stingy with upgrade materials too. It's very likely you'll only ever upgrade 2, maybe 3 to peak efficiency over the course of a full playthrough, so players get pretty attached to their weapons and their builds. It's really worth considering in a series that hands the player an absolute hurricane of bladed kill sticks and forces them to choose. I think one of the 2 major design focuses with 3 is combat. Not just mechanics, but encounters. Consider the levels and the enemies found within. Now that 2 and its sensibilities are on the table, and linearity is part of the fundamental design, you're made to fight some really tight and well-considered battles throughout the levels. Any Souls player who's pulled through the series up until now probably won't find them overly painful, but I distinctly remember making a point of running through to hit as many checkpoints as I could the first time I played. I have to highlight the village again for throwing some basic enemies in the player's face first, then opening up into a freeform battle with a pack of unsuspecting, easily backstabbed enemies and a single giant enemy that'll whomp you if you don't face him solo, or you can sneak around the encounter entirely, but you're rewarded with an Estus shard, a flask upgrade for completing it. Later on, you're given a tight alley and a pack of charging enemies, alongside a guy on a bridge with a homing projectile, but critically, a house to duck into for safety, allowing you to dispatch the foot soldiers and rush the ladder down the way. Many of the levels are like this, posing unique gambits that consider the actual environment, and it makes for compelling moment-to-moment play. I mean, aside from the lake, the f*** is that all about? It's hard to talk about the DLC levels. They're fine, and create some really memorable sights and scenes for the series. Basically redoing the painted world of Ariamis from the first is a pretty clear signal from the studio that they either really liked the original setting enough that they wanted more of it, or they want to convey how tired the world is. Kinda hard to say. And the other available zone, the Ringed City, is a dangerous, sprawling, multi-tiered area that's actually great for PvP. It's the only place I actually found regular PvP at my level. I forced a guy off a cliff. I am not very good at Souls PvP. I don't want to touch on them because, aside from some really obnoxious little design pieces, the arrow volley and other crap, there's nothing really notable about them from a gameplay perspective that's not represented in the other levels. The damage is so high in 3 that you end up just blazing through where you can. You're steeled by that point, you know? Not taking it in as much as putting it down. And I could keep going, but the point is, many encounters in the game make intelligent use of space and placement, but ask the player to find a solution that has nothing to do with dex or int or faith or whatever stat, but rather basic mechanics and environmental thinking. This, alongside the frequent bonfires, means the game caters to many builds while attempting to challenge all players equally. And unlike 2's general damage type imbalances, by the way, 3 does pretty well at balancing resistances across the board. So the build. After playing Strength, Faith, Basic Quality, and Hexer, I wanted to have a little fun. So I kinda went Strength and then went Quality again down the line, but point is, I got the Farron Greatsword. And that weapon art? Those flips? Oh my god! I know it's cliche, but the Farron Greatsword is such a beautiful and elegant weapon. Its strange ducks and flips, all performed with the dedicated weapon art button, actually provide a janky built-in dodge so you can mash into a lot of enemies, but not every enemy. Spellcasters and other ranged attackers were dangerous, and swarms were manageable, but could rack up damage if I sat around in my attacking frames, otherwise vulnerable to hyper-aggressive types as my stamina drained out. Like, get hyped for 3 if you're a fighting game fan. One weapon art on a particular sword gives you super armor. Like, you can just armor through attacks. There's so many fantastic weapon arts and interesting ways to play that Dark Souls 3, with its considered encounters and striking levels, it's got more replayability in my mind than most of the franchise. I want another run. I love this game and its animations. That's nothing to sneeze at. People get mad that FromSoft makes a point of reusing assets between games, but if it's saving dev time, and in the case of weapon arts, allowing the studio to create these unreal animations and make the game sing in the frame, it's only for the best. Catering to the build trademark is like the ultimate in supporting player sovereignty, and the encounters are tuned for it. I'm trying to empathize with the haters, bro. I want to know why you ain't like builds and want to f*** a map instead. Like, do you roll it up? What the devs care about, where their money goes, and what they push, is like the design thesis of the game, right? Maybe that's an oversimplification, Kojima cutscenes, etc., but 3 pushed weapon animations and boss animations. In the old days, many bosses were repeated, reappeared later on, had stiff or otherwise frugal animations, yeah? Shoot, 2 made basic enemies the boss more than once, and they put their gold into what counted, but they didn't go truly insane with the stuff until 3, after a deep bedrock of repurposable assets existed. In a way, Dark Souls' development and its actual universe, a series of kingdoms built on top of other kingdoms, run parallel. The games and their development are mimetic of their worlds. What the fuck? Anyhow, the bosses are immaculate. At some point, someone realized that since people could and would run directly to the boss rooms, and Shrine of Amana was at one point an area of a Dark Souls game, they ensured the bosses were tough, frequently powered up partway through, and overall represented a quality mix of player challenges. When I look back at the list and think of who I would remove first, it's the gimmick fight, Yorm the Giant, because gimmicks aren't relevant to the player's build, and the Ancient Wyvern, which, amazing environment, and you technically could fight it, but it's a setup for a big epic plunge attack that kind of eviscerates the interest in killing a dragon. Nice visual though. The rest are amazing. Take the very first boss, a very Souls-esque knight-type enemy with broader sweeping strikes and great reach, but more than that, he fights with these wild, fluid motions, and right away the game hits the Dark Souls high when the pus of man, this abyss shadow, grows out of him, and now his range and damage are insane, and you've got to be really deliberate. Awesome fight, super striking and memorable. Vort is kinda crazy because he can do this obnoxious charge move. Almost everything else is immaterial, but he can and will mix you up with how many times he charges, and the damage is so high, one wrong move means death. I want to dislike that, but dodging matters. Some people want a fat roll, but you won't survive over encumbered for long, and Vort checks that real quick. The early game set some real high expectations with the curse-rotted Greatwood, a fairly average fight that drops the floor from underneath the player. Yeah, now we're playing with whole environments and like fundamental rules of play, because there's no fall damage here, though there normally would be. Then you're stuck helpless underground with this really tough boss fight. The Crystal Sage makes use of ranged attacks and clones. I was surprised how tough the fight was this time around, but how willing I was to get up and do it again. More than other games, I'd argue, 3 makes use of crazy damage values and it leads to some intense battles. The problem I see blooming here is one that becomes especially relevant in the DLC and more so in Elden Ring, but we'll talk when we get there. The Deacons of the Deep harkens back to Dark Souls 2, even Bloodborne, but they're not too much to talk about. Done that already. Many of the beast or giant type bosses are cool by virtue of standing out. Wolnir, the giant undead whose bangles need to be shattered to win the fight, is a great example of a battle that's more atmosphere than combat. The goal is simple, but it's made difficult by the skeletons in the arena. The boss's giant stature rendering him untouchable at times. He's highly telegraphed but slightly harder to dodge because of the darkness and his hands that extend out of sight. It's not perfect, but it encapsulates the fear of being dragged down into the darkness well. And the old Demon King seems familiar at first, but unleashes so many nonsensical, dangerous fire attacks. Big dumb brutes in Souls games usually just crush or smash, but this guy makes you dance. It's scary. Most of the other bosses feel like highly lethal duels with other great warriors of your era, like the Abyss Watchers who can be parried, staggered, treated like other enemies, but supercharge it! Pontiff Sullivan is such an insane fight. I have no idea how he went down this time. Even though the fight is tough and memorable, it's worth noting that, at least according to PS4 stats, Dark Souls 3 doesn't have a lot of player-based filter moments, just the one between the very first boss and Vort, with only one level separating them. After that, the game tends to lose 1 to 4% of the player base each boss, which seems reasonable for Dark Souls. Even the supposed hardest fight in the game, discounting TLC, has a 50% achievement unlock rate, so either the game's good, the fans know what to expect, or the encounters are balanced. It's a smooth experience, right? Souls done pop the Jurgens. The Dancer of the Boreal Valley is another incredible duel that demands fast and repeated reactions from players. It's a perfect display of the fluidity of animation that devs worked for. And let's throw Aldrich into this for their sweeping attacks and massive, hard-to-avoid magic carpet bombings. It's a pretty common thread in Souls discussion that the games need an easy mode, and it sucks listening to because, yeah, I also don't see a problem with cheating through an old RPG if you get to experience the story cutscenes and it's for your own fun. Good on you. Souls could have an easy mode, and arguably all the ways the player can power up and even cheese certain fights and make use of summons for most, but not all, are the intended way to make the games easy, but Miyazaki's made it pretty clear that he wants players to experience the joy of overcoming struggle. I contend he means that with a little asterisk, like as long as you find a way, it's valid, no matter the way. It's a nice idea, but falls apart pretty easily because plenty of people are already struggling between disabilities, ridiculous underpaid hours, all kinds of stuff. Like, great if you have the time and the ability to beat all these. And I'm just saying, think what you want about the art and how it's best enjoyed. But if you make a public talking point that others need to experience it as intended by the artist, please stop talking. There's too much self-serving, back-patting chicanery from online bros who want to think their guts for beating a game. I get it, you have nothing but sneering contempt for anyone who can't do what you can. Brought a megaphone for the quiet part, huh? You know, hard games are kind of dime a dozen. Lots of stuff's hard, with all kinds of differing contexts for difficulty, but only
Souls sold en masse, and I like to think it's a little deeper than Ooga Booga Me Beat Hard Game.
You fight a couple more armors because Dark Souls 2 is all armor, guys. It's only armor, guys, you guys, and now we're in hell. The game's remaining fights are immensely difficult, if only because you need to memorize their movesets somewhat wholesale to survive, and they're frustrating specifically because I felt forced into a specific playstyle to win, and when I did, it was trivially easy, meaning the illusion of choice kind of shattered in a second. The Twin Princes, the final boss, and all the DLCs and bosses fit into this category. I mean, take the Twin Princes, a boss that fires off huge waves of magic you can just barely dodge running full tilt, a boss that'll teleport off screen, screwing up your lock-on, and he's got enough range to hit you off camera. It's not particularly fun. And the second phase has the other prince healing the big guy on occasion, so you really have to lay into him while weaving your way through tons of magical crap. The Nameless King is, well, some people call him the hardest boss in the Souls series. I think that's been overturned since, but again with the double phases, the massive move pools, the intense damage these guys do, and how strict the dodge windows are for some moves. The ultimate boss battles include him, the Soulless Cinder, Sister Freed, and Slave Knight Gale. Oh boy. As I've said, you can't summon an NPC ally for these fights, with the exception of half the Freed fight. The game wants you to handle them on your own, playing directly into the oft-touted community opinion that you haven't truly beaten a Souls boss unless you did it solo, without summons. It's kind of frustrating because I never really got the hype. I've played hard games before, I've had my little victories, and it's an extremely tightrope to be walking for a video game, assuming its bosses are tuned just finely enough to not be bullshit. But yeah, Nameless King is pretty much bullshit. If the damage were cut by 25%, he wouldn't be a problem. But here we are. The Soul of Cinder, the final boss, isn't unbearable because of damage as much as his exceptionally varied move pool. Dude literally transforms multiple times, swaps from caster to assassin to warrior. It's tough getting a grasp on every moveset and every punish window. I stopped dead at this fight the very first time I played for that reason. Sister Freed is among the most annoying fights in the game, featuring invisible ambushes and too late audio cues, so you're made to preempt when she's going invisible to punish before the attack ever goes off. And in Phase 2, you have a summoned ally. That's cool, but you're also fighting a lava-spilling Hulk while Freed herself goes mental. It's just a lot to keep track of. And Slave Knight Gale is literally the blueprint for end bosses in Elden Ring, a fight that's, again, 2 phases and totally jam-packed with unique animations and hard-to-dodge attacks. It feels like the only way the Souls team knows for sure to challenge people. Up the damage, increase attack counts, tighten player dodge windows, and restrict punish opportunities. I'm not saying it's bad, just very specific. And while I like these fights in retrospect, they forced me to abandon my build. I didn't fully respec, I just did the lame thing. I put down the greatsword and re-equipped my old love, the longsword, propped up my shield, and took no more than 2 attacks at any given time. I beat every one of these bosses in a single sitting afterwards. It sucked. I compromised on what I cared about and played as lame as possible. Still felt amazing after finishing Gale. I won't lie, I'm usually pretty dull on tough boss wins these days, like yeah, that should have happened 3 hours ago, but I was actually screaming here.
Bitch, I got him! I beat him! Yeah!
The takeaway is that Souls was never this strict, but it's how the design evolved going forward. I've played Sekiro and Elden Ring now, and damn, they knew they found the secret formula to creating an entire subgenre of Souls content on YouTube for cheesing boss battles. Yikes. So, how'd they cap off the final Dark Souls game? Unless you fish for a secret ending by doing a series of strange things you'd never know to do implicitly, the endings of the past games are repeated again. I have a hard time caring about the events of the game over the raw world building because that's where the fun is, mostly. And after realizing that the same set of endings is handed to the player constantly. On one hand, amazing work committing to the bit. On the other, can we please just light this up already? It's old. It's tired. People have pretty spirited debates about the endings, and part of the problem inherent to Souls endings is we don't have all the information. It's just not available. For example, Dark is not the Abyss, but is related to the Abyss, I guess. It's hard then to know if linking the flame forever and heaping calamities is at all worthwhile for temporary preservation of life. If ending the flame means that someday another species will rise and have another chance of potentially doing everything on screen again. Or if usurping the flame, jacking the power for yourself and more or less doing what happened at the end of 2 will lead humanity to a better place, but as we know, all ages end. The intractable problem of the Souls universe is the gods don't really serve humanity is doomed to irrelevance without the flame alongside the gods, the world seems to support inherent hierarchies. Rules as written, add a baseline. It's a fun thing to talk about, but leads to the same frustrations inherent to internet atheism versus Christianity debates. Like, there's never gonna be a sufficient answer. So why are we talking about it? Fun for the banter anyway. For now, it seems that FromSoft is fine with letting the fire fade. I've been wandering, reflecting for a very long time, Spirit.
For what?
For myself. And I got to thinking that I remember you.
Oh, is that so?
Your name. It's... Bloodborne's been sitting in my top 10 since I played it, but I'm not really sure why. It's one of the coolest things I've played. A lot of holy crap! Yeah, that. I love the aesthetic. I think it's an easier run than some of the main series titles, and its world feels juicier, more ripe than Dark Souls. Plus, it's just disgusting.
No, don't do that.
And not to sound like a doofus, but I get some real Resident Evil 4 vibes playing it, even if it's a surface-level comparison. And that's my favorite game, the most enjoyable, interesting, and tightly designed experience I can think of. Bloodborne really isn't that. It can't be. It's from the Souls lineage. You know, the series that'll let you wander off the path and die. The series that'll throw a level inappropriate enemy in the corner. The series that doesn't often account for every build. The series that lets players get in over their heads. It could never be RE4. That experience is razor sharp, forward-flowing, and self-regulating in terms of difficulty. So how'd Bloodborne pull top 10? It's something like common wisdom in the Souls community that your first is your favorite, so let's interrogate that claim. Bloodborne was released between Dark Souls 2 and 3 at a time when Souls was inherently slow. No matter which of the early catalog you're playing, Demons 1 or 2, the games are all fairly sluggish, slug-like, slug-esque. It isn't until the third entry that the pace picks up and you struggle to land backstabs on basic knights. So even now, locked away on the PS4 and capped at 30 FPS on a good day, Bloodborne is exciting by comparison. The play is fast, anxious, risky, calculated, adjectives, it's fire. That's the only word I need. Just don't play it immediately after, like, Nioh or something. It'll feel like molasses. It's usually placed really high or low on Souls difficulty tier lists. Nobody can really agree on the hardest Souls game. Even though Sekiro's the obvious answer to me, Bloodborne ranks near the top for others. Somehow. Seriously guys, the circle button's right there. I talk pretty frequently about context for difficulty because difficulty isn't experienced in a vacuum. What's hard for some instantly clicks for others, like with school subjects. Bloodborne is tough for some old fans specifically because it throws out most of their learned behaviors and makes them dance. Those early games built a mindful, patient player who threw up a shield when in doubt and played safe otherwise. Dodge rolling was important, but it wasn't everything. Shoot, you could ignore dodge rolling with great shields, poise tanking, etc. Then Bloodborne sweeps in with a whole new combat system and mucks it all up. But before we dig into that, let's lay the base. Bloodborne takes place in a totally different universe than the Souls series. Even though there seems to be an implied connection to Demon Souls in the alpha version with Father Gascoigne using the religious word Umbasa, all ties were effectively severed in the final product. So we get Yharnam, a gothic megacity. Seriously, just look at the architecture. Currently suffering from a deadly epidemic, the Beast Plague, which drives men mad and even transforms them into murder machines. Swap the word plague for fog, and that's basically the plot of Demon Souls, except Bloodborne trades one king dealing with an elder god for a deeply corrupt set of institutions, mostly the Healing Church, that brought all this on the populace by taking the old blood, literally the blood of the elder gods, and using its restorative properties to perform miraculous healing via blood transfusion. That's gotta be at least one single yike. Right? So Eldritch Horror, you know, Innsmouth, Cthulhu, that whole aesthetic is seeded into the game. Regardless of your opinion on cosmic horror, it's a pretty big draw for nerds. And why not? It's a cool concept. The idea that entities literally beyond your human comprehension exist and will drive you insane to even gaze at is an interesting frame for horror. Hard to meaningfully imagine, so it manages to occupy the imagination. Bloodborne doesn't do a ton with the idea. Like, it doesn't push its mechanics to really sell that concept well, except for Insight and Frenzy. Not that the Cthulhu games were incredible at representing cosmic horror flawlessly either, and we'll get into it later, but suffice it to say that the aesthetics function as table dressing, and really I don't think you could sell a Souls game, a build-based power fantasy, with cosmic horror anyhow. If you get into combat in the Call of Cthulhu RPG, you're probably dead, but it's worth making a note regardless. You play as a hunter, a skirmisher, stripped of armor and shield and armed with brutal, mechanical weapons that transform to accommodate evolving combat situations. As the beasts of the world became swifter and more deadly to immobile knights, speed and utility became the weapons of choice. That's right, you can smash through clay pots slightly more efficiently than usual. Okay, I know that's a minor point, but just give it to me. A lot of thought and effort has been channeled into Bloodborne to meaningfully differentiate it from the Souls games, justify those decisions in-universe, and provide a pull for newcomers who might have skipped over the other titles for fear they were too hard or looked too boring. You're not just a stock fantasy knight, but a guy in coat. Everyone loves guys with coats. Here's some famous men in coats. I rest my case. It's hard not to appreciate, and the cosmic horror conceit aids all this by slowly unveiling itself to the player during a playthrough, and building a heightening internal drama. Can the lowly coatman kill God? The other Souls games have heightening stakes as well. Players go from rooting out small-time scourges to killing living legends. That isn't new, but the way Bloodborne sells its rising stakes is much more impactful as the player grapples with beings and forces beyond their understanding. Let's take a walk through the intro. You wake up, receive blood ministration by a strange man, wander through a spooky clinic, and die in a fight with a beast. That takes all of 5 minutes, in contrast with earlier titles, and sees you off to the Hunter's Dream where you'll have your choice of starting weaponry. Oh, and the creep from the opening cutscenes there in the house, talking about use the dole out front if it pleases you. Get me the f*** out of here. You've been chosen as a hunter. Your purpose is to kill beasts. Gehrman here tells you himself, go out and kill. Dying will shunt you back to the Hunter's Dream, so you're trapped in a never-ending cycle of waking into a nightmare. So get killing. Bloodborne doesn't opt for a slower-paced tutorial segment, something the Souls games traditionally used. Instead, you pop into Central Yharnam, kill some guys, climb a ladder, hear a horrible roar off in the distance.
Yeah, pipe down, I'm coming.
And that's it. That's the extent of the tutorial. You've got a whole sprawling level, an optional boss, and a story boss standing between you and the game given right to level up. And don't worry, it's at least as hard as the Undead Bird. For a spin-off with new mechanics, that's bold. That's a cup of dark roast, son. There's an argument that Bloodborne uses its opening level as a raw player filter. Sure, we could call the whole thing a tutorial, but it's nowhere near the triviality of the other titles. Demons gave you little head pats all the way through, and then whomped your ass. One was pretty tame all around, ass-whomper notwithstanding. Bloodborne won't even let you grind your way to victory if you're stuck on the cleric beast. Or, because it's an optional boss, Gascoigne, who requires the player learn how to parry. It's learn or return. Hope you kept your receipt. But now normally that'd bother me a bit, but I think it's worth the time spent grappling with mechanics. Bloodborne was my first Souls game, and it took anywhere from 4 to 6 hours for the game to click. It didn't come easy, but I was playing Final Fantasy 15 concurrently at the time, and basically put that game down and never went back. In any case, I think Bloodborne pays off harder than most Souls games do, all while funneling players through a concise experience that mostly accounts for build diversity while maintaining the integrity and value of its new systems. It's a Souls game. Gehrman told me it's a Souls game by contextualizing the gameplay as something I'll enjoy doing, regardless of the running narrative. So let's focus on the game. For now. Some elements of the Souls design lineage are left mostly unchanged. The world takes cues from Dark Souls 1, being largely interconnected and often in surprising ways. Lore and world building take a seat ahead of story, as per usual, and the few NPCs you meet are either untrustworthy or ill-fated, without much wiggle room. Oh hey, there's a safe house! A cathedral where you can gather up survivors and make them your pals! Sure hope there's no Demon Souls-ass psychopaths around here. And like Dark Souls, no matter how the weapons have changed, you're incentivized to be an L1 spamming machine, slapping monsters and dashing around. You still drop your souls, renamed Blood Echoes, on death, and lose them permanently if you fail to reach them before dying again. You channel Blood Echoes into yourself to level up, a stat spread, and upgrade your weapons to increase your power. That's all familiar. That's Souls.
Oh, just shut your ass.
Oh yeah, that's Dark Souls. Even though the infrastructure is recognizable, small changes, shifts, and notches warp the experience into something bizarre, and even intoxicating to play. And that's the point of the changes. A light ludonarrative harmony crops up in the combat. The player, a hunter who's received blood ministration and carries the beast plague, is incentivized to act bestial. This is justified in the lore, but mechanically you're rewarded for giving into impulse and acting on instinct. Instinct, in this case, being represented in the hastened and lengthened quick step and dodge roll, and the backstep option. You're handed a series of upgraded mobility tools to compensate for a lack of useful shields, and due to the lengthened invincibility time and general rewards for aggression, you're even incentivized to dodge into oncoming attacks to beat the hitbox and keep combat flowing. Giving into impulse is represented in the rally mechanic. Basically, if you take damage, you'll be able to recoup some of it by striking your enemy in a small time frame. You're actively rewarded for giving in to base urges and punishing your enemy. That's such an enormous change, just emotionally, and it's exclusive to Bloodborne. In the old games, getting impatient and going for revenge hits on any challenging enemy would cost you your life, more often than not. Bloodborne wants you seeing red. To a point, anyway. Healing with rally can't account for quality play. And in that sense, Bloodborne is simply more forgiving than Dark Souls. No shields, but better dodges. Free heals. It's like the millennials are all out here getting freebies, man. The genius of combat is its consistency. There are all kinds of enemies in this game, but they blend into a slurry in your dance of death. Not to be needlessly poetic, Sekiro's combat is often referred to as a dance, but Bloodborne really captures the concept best, I find, as you weave in and out of enemy attacks, change rhythm with the various types of enemies, but never really stop moving. Maybe only to fire off a bullet on occasion or charge an attack. Enemies are all aggressive and highly lethal. Several will grab you and deal fatal damage if you're not topped off, and your defensive options are so limited, those options mostly being mobility related, that combat physically flows much more than the other Souls games, and more organically reflects the dance concept. And you know what? Thank God for Bloodborne figuring out that the Souls parry sucks. I'm sorry, the microfraction of the fanbase that actually made regular use of the system should be indicative enough, right? The games don't do well with parry. Lots of other games make use of audio and visual cues, and in Dark Souls you're mostly going by eye. But Bloodborne has mobile warriors and is vaguely Victorian. Enter the gun, a long-ranged parry tool held in the offhand. Not every attack is parryable, like before, but at least you can leave some space and experiment at will. And it's tied to a consumable resource, bullets, so even though it's safer and more powerful in general, it's not totally abusable. I think the gun might be the smartest combat innovation in the Souls series, and it's exclusive to Bloodborne. Love that. Means I can keep saying Bloodborne is genius. You might imagine a speedy character like the Hunter would be capable of sneaking, but not really. I mean, most enemies are placed to see you in seconds, though the game will sometimes throw you a bone and reward a sneaky player.
Shut the fuck up, shut the fuck up. I'm gonna sneak up and stab him to death with my weapon. Hey! Happy birthday!
While backstabs functionally exist, they're much harder to land in general, requiring a charged attack at an enemy's back. Several enemies can be crumpled through this back attack method, damage, and other means, greenlighting the visceral attack, an execution-style invincible health walloper. And I gotta tell you, paired with the rally mechanic, it goes from satisfaction to nutbust in a second. Speaking of victory, the game makes use of Demon Souls-esque healing in the form of a consumable, blood vials, which function like standardized Demon Souls grass, and you can hold up to 20. The system's divisive because it's great, but it sucks. I mean, I love it because it means I can brute force boss fights with 20 vials if I'm really not playing my best, but the issue is forcing players to grind when they're out. Just running around the town, harvesting blood. I'm a hero, I promise. It's easy to miss the reliability of the Estus Flask regardless. Thankfully, you can buy blood vials, and indeed, every time I kill a boss and level up, I dump the rest of my echoes into healing items, so the game has smoothing options for the grind, and especially for a good player. Meanwhile, beginners are getting free attack heals skills and fewer options to worry about in combat. Just keep focused, keep dashing, hug ass, and smack. If beginners are being made to grind, they're being put back out into the world they clearly haven't mastered yet, and that's not the worst punishment. I mentioned that the map of Bloodborne isn't much different than Dark Souls, and that's mostly accurate. Many of the areas you're meant to complete in sequence are either contiguous with one another, or are accessed via routes established early enough in the game that they should be known to the player. And like Dark Souls, you're free to complete several areas out of strict order, allowing you to fight certain bosses early and even change the fate of some NPCs. Like Jura here, the hunter manning the Gatling gun in Old Yarnum.
I was looking for secrets.
Normally you'd enter the zone, be told to back off, go along anyway, get shot at, climb up to Jura's perch and fight him face to face. It's easiest to whip out your pistol and let him have it. Yeah, that's why they call me Quick Draw McGraw. But you can actually befriend Jura by getting killed by one of these bagmen, taken to Yahar'gul, killing a boss, and working your way through the level backwards, basically. Now, on account of my name's Quick Draw McGraw, I have never bothered with that kind of thing, but it's pretty impressive to allow and account for a sequence to play out in multiple ways. Even accessing Yahar'gul by dying is, like, ambrosially incredible. Bloodborne isn't a game I find scary, but it definitely makes use of many kinds of horror. Teleporting an unsuspecting player to another zone entirely, possibly one that's level inappropriate and dimly lit in general, is such an awe-inspiring prank. It's a game that lets players get lost in the hunt for answers, for power, for secrets. It's an enthralling thing to experience the first time, and absolutely the first game I'd wipe all memory of for another shot of that intrigue. The levels aren't all killer, though, to be clear. Central Yarnum is great for its introductory status, tight encounters, general verticality. Like I said in the first video, Dark Souls' first levels are fun. Old Yarnum is enjoyable despite its linearity, especially because the Gatling gun fire keeps the player frantic throughout. Hemwick Chapel Lane is interesting for similar reasons to the intro level. It's smaller, but several whens and ways exist that make it feel discoverable, even if it's relatively small. Otherwise, most levels are too tiny to be worth discussion. Bergenworth is a small place with a building. The lecture hall is cool, but serves as a light antechamber between zones. The Nightmare Frontier can piss off. Yahar'gul and the respawning enemies and laser blasts can piss off. Canehurst and the Bloodlickers can piss off. It's so much easier to remember levels as that annoying one with that dumb bullshit. Not a great sell, TBH. Yahar'gul is doable, but it's a fairly stiff challenge at a point where the player's build really starts to matter, and it's a little more tense than most of the game. The Nightmare Frontier is just frustrating, with multiple hazards that impede player mobility, so many traps and obstacles and poison, because why not add poison and the first Winter Lantern? Let me ask you something. You want to simulate cosmic horror insanity in a video game. Would you include a mechanic that, in short, has a bar fill up rapidly within range of an insanity-inducing enemy that causes an instant 70% damage when the bar fills up, and the only way to meaningfully combat the effect is killing the enemy? Okay. I'll just tuck that away for later. I'm keeping score, you know. Bloodborne can be a frustrating experience, especially around the mid-game as builds start to coalesce, the world begins to open up, and all the weird individual level gimmicks and frustrations become apparent in rapid succession. I've always had the best time in the beginning when the challenge is vanilla, and near the end when the player's build is truly online. I would never call Bloodborne a bad time, but games got grime. Of course, those bumps make the journey memorable, and if it were smooth the whole way, it'd pass you by, you know? In and out in seconds. Like my fist in this pig's ass! Make sure to get your rectum inspected! This is not a joke. And how you engage with the world, the gameplay, the combat is similar to any other Souls game. With your build. Weapons are everything in Bloodborne, I'd argue, and it's because of what they imply about the game and how they diverge from traditional Souls weapons. While options are limited, at least compared to the absolute deluge of sharp crap in Dark Souls, the player is presented with a select series of meaningful and viable choices, without having to worry about the finer details differentiating a claymore and a Zweihander, a longsword and a nightsword. If you pick the Chikage, the lone katana in the game, you've got the best katana in the game. While old Souls Souls weapons could be double-handed, opening up additional moves, they were all fundamentally themselves. A halberd held in two hands might gain thrusting attacks and be more useful in corridors, but it's still a halberd. Bloodborne, conversely, took advantage of steampunk-esque mechanical designs that could change shape to function like the Souls halberd we just looked at, or get a little silly. And really, we could all benefit from getting a little silly. Some weapons get buffed, like the Chikage, a weapon that, on transformation, becomes coated with blood and deals piles of damage at the cost of the wielder's health. Some weapons become other weapons, like the Holy Moonlight Sword becoming the Moonlight Greatsword, or the Whirligig Saw, which starts as a cudgel and becomes a gigantic Beyblade on a stick. Damn, Bloodborne kinda Beyblade coated, huh? They range from bizarre to magical to totally mundane. The Hunter's Cleaver just swings out, increasing its range. Several don't shift dramatically in case you want your weapons to feel more Souls-like, low-key, but the allure of the hyper-stylish arms is hard to resist. It's part of Bloodborne's strategy. Looking cool is more important than being super innovative, and I respect that immensely. If you're gonna get the long coat, might as well drip up your arsenal too. In a series that was already getting mildly tired, looking fresh and fun is the right play. It's important to mention that upgrade materials are fairly limited. In the base game, you can only find a single Blood Rock, the strongest upgrade material, once per playthrough, and a second if you've got DLC access. So the player is funneled into one or two weapons to really invest in over the course of a run. And that's not unheard of for Souls, but being strictly limited to an extremely cool weapon of choice on a character that's dripping with gothic flair elevates the aesthetics of the build to heights yet unmatched for the series, at least in Demons to 2. 3 may have challenged Bloodborne's claim to cool with its weapon arts, but Bloodborne's unique visuals keep it in the running regardless. That's one of Bloodborne's best qualities, the build and how it relates to the playthrough. Like any Souls game, you'll hoard stats into a few areas of interest. You've got vitality, endurance, strength, skill, or some say dexterity, blood tinge, and arcane. Every stat not related to hit points or stamina pumps the damage of this or that weapon. Blood tinge sounds weird, but it mostly buffs guns and blood weapons. If you stick to health and a couple of damage stats, you're set. You can even safely ignore stamina for the most part. I have in every playthrough. The game actually gives you enough at a baseline to function. It's incredible. Finding a build is more about finding a weapon you like and pumping its stats. The Chikage needs skill and blood tinge? Done. Easy. The Whirligig Saw needs strength? Easy. It's so easy! Simplified, focused, interesting. Bloodborne is an experiment in compressing the multitudinous options of the Souls games and churning out diamonds. You don't have every option on a single playthrough, but that only makes it more exciting to jump back in. It's one of the few games I felt compelled to run on New Game Plus. One of the few games I found worth more than a few runs. In the past, I ran with the Claymore, Ludwig's Holy Blade, and it carved up the game like nothing. Finding the Chikage, though, I couldn't not run through again with a blood katana. Man, what do I look like, an animal? So I went back. I've run with the Moonlight Greatsword and the Rikuyo. This game has always felt sharp, responsive, exciting, even focusing on a single weapon per run. It's never gotten stale. This run, I decided to challenge myself with something I'd never used, the Beast Cutter. Basically the strength version of the Threaded Cane's starting weapon. It's fairly slow and unwieldy, hard to recommend. In fact, I dropped it entirely for the Whirligig Saw by the very end. But set that aside for a second. Like all Souls games, your weapon of choice dictates your playthrough. Using the Beast Cutter, I had bad rally healing. The weapon just isn't good at it, regardless of slow swing speed. It can outrange most enemies and flatten enemy hunters. That's its strength. But it's hard to justify a slow zoning weapon in an aggressive game. You will get swarmed and you will take hits for screwing around, even a little, with the whip version. I loaded up with strength to make the most of the thing, but even though I was unsatisfied with the weapon, I could have dove out any time for the Hunter's Cleaver or Ludwig's Holy Blade. Though the game has limited options, there's almost always another option to salvage a rough run, and enough drip to salvage a terrible bore. What Bloodborne has over its predecessors is time. It's a short run, something like 10 hours if you know where to go and don't trip up too often. That and it tends to be easier than other games. That's fascinating for a Souls game. While you can speedrun through the lineage, the average player will often run up the clock, stumbling around through areas, collecting things, backtracking, etc. But between Bloodborne's fast travel, knowledge, and build focus, it's easy to sit down and pull another run. With arguably mediocre levels in some, okay, I like a lot of them, but let's be honest, honest, the player is incentivized to blaze through and put down the bosses. It's like the game flips a switch and turns into a boss rush on New Game Plus. It's genuinely impressive how differently playthroughs can turn out. So many bosses are outright optional. So many areas can be ignored, and the bosses feel more like notches in your belt than trophies on the wall. I'd go as far as saying that very few of them matter from a design perspective, just occupying the biggest hole of the area chair until you come along and knock it off. The Cleric Beast is an optional but stiff early challenge that encourages experimentation with items, and unlike several bosses, can be stunned with gunshots aimed at the head, opening up visceral attacks. It's weirdly experimental in a way that most other bosses aren't, if only by virtue of the player's coalesced build overshadowing item tricks and headshot gimmicks later on. Gascoigne would be worth commentary, but he's explicitly designed to check parry skill, though he has narrative value for showing what hunters drunk with blood and succumbing to the plague can become. The blood-starved beast is an obnoxious enemy that flings itself all over the arena while spreading poison. Alongside Vicar Amelia and her occasional healing, several bosses only really have one or two gimmicks beyond, swipe, swipe, bite. Some bosses feel incomplete or serve as fake-outs. The Celestial Emissary and the DLC's Living Failures, both weak bosses heading up much more powerful enemies. Pour one out for the players who lanterned home after the emissaries and never jumped through the nearby window. The camera isn't the worst in this entry, but it's got issues. The Amygdala fight has our disgusting friend lift his hands out of the camera's view, making it frustrating to see attacks coming. Even Dark Beast Parl can run into this issue with his enormous, highly mobile body constantly playing with the player's vision. The game makes use of a few minion bosses, the kind maybe inspired by Dark Souls 2. The Witch of Hemwick feels kinda like a gimme. Its minions are frustrating, but the witch's health is so low, it's hard to complain. And Rom may be one of the most annoying fights, if only because patience is the only clear path to victory, either by clearing out every spider, God forbid, or weaving between spiderlings to slash at the real enemy, to say nothing of the immensely damaging magical attacks. Other bosses feel close, but not quite good enough for a game as storied and well-reviewed as Bloodborne. The One Reborn is actually fairly inoffensive. It's possible to switch off your brain and run him down to Unga Town, but realizing that the arena is lined with projectile spammers you should clear out complicates things. Even worse, his Viscera Rain ability and Vomit just don't visually convey how lethal they are. The Viscera Rain, because it strikes 3 times without much fanfare. I mean, it's hard enough to even register the attack in the chaos, setting aside having to figure out that it strikes 3 times with no indication, and the Vomit actually damages the player before it's fully materialized on screen, which is just infuriating. Plus, it's gigantic. You're absolutely swimming in puke by the time you're in trouble. Special shout out to Mikolash here for running between rooms and requiring a good amount of footwork to hunt down. It's not an exciting fight, and he deals extreme damage, making the battle tense, but fairly tedious. Same goes for Murgo, having an extended period of invulnerability that's also highly lethal. Not a fan, but the fight is easy enough. The fights I tend to like come from the later bosses, DLC fights included, but not all. My favorite nowadays may well be the Shadows of Yharnam, a 3-man fight, each opponent equipped with a different moveset. It takes full advantage of Bloodborne's general mobility, and rewards the player for learning to parry, but not as freely as Gascoigne, meaning the player has to actually embody what the combat is teaching to pull through. Otherwise, Ebritus, Martyr Logarius, Gehrman, Lawrence, Ludwig, Maria, and the Orphan of Kos are incredible battles. Each of them feature high damage, a mix of range-based and melee threats, require the player to stay active, occasionally ask the player to switch up their style mid-battle, usually evolve themselves in fantastical, eye-catching ways that keep the blood pumping. And that's everything in a game like Bloodborne, where the levels are hit or miss, where some of the bosses are memes, where the game can drag at times, and the thing keeping you moving is the promise of power, and looking really badass getting it. These fights feel like accomplishments, even in the late game. I'm going to exclude discussion of the DLC as gameplay. It basically functions as an amalgam of previously used areas, at least until the final stretch, and it's highly challenging overall, but it won't fully stop a dedicated player from running all the way through. In short, it's perfect for Souls, giving the player an incredible environment and letting them choose to engage how they want. What the bosses do well, in harmony with the levels and mechanics, is tell an escalating tale of doom, filtered through the lens of cosmic horror. Things start small. You're a person with a purpose, killing beasts, and you strike down a series of increasingly powerful monsters, including one of your own kind, someone like you, until you reach the Grand Cathedral and put down a clergy member, Vicar Amelia. This is the first point of no return, and the player is turned loose in Yharnam again as night falls over the city. Things are colder, enemies are more dangerous, and all the while you're gaining insight, this little number that you can spend for gear and stuff, whatever, but more importantly changes the world itself. See, occasionally you come across spooky things, like a giant door that can't be opened as, what the f is that? What the fuck? And after killing Rum, the vacuous spider, hidden in the lake at Bergenworth, the blood moon rises, changing the world once again. Eventually, you'll have 50 insight, deepening the move pools of certain enemies and revealing that this whole time you've been watched by these massive, horrible creatures, the amygdala. Bloodborne is not a scary game the way that Resident Evil 7 maybe is. It doesn't often use jump scares, though I think Yosefka's clinic is pretty spooky. But what it does do is reveal things to the player, hidden right under their nose. And all of that is served incredibly well by Soul's storytelling. The way information is denied to the player and trickled in through item descriptions and untrustworthy NPC dialogue. Bloodborne might not blow your mind, but it does things with its own internal information economy that really fires the imagination, really tunes players into the universe. It builds this escalation of terror so thoroughly too. Take old Yharnam and the Gatling gun, the one major environmental hindrance in the zones, and how it parallels with the late game brain of Mensis, which frenzies you at range without you ever being struck by something so mundane as a bullet. Just an eerie glow and drone, an unstoppable status ailment. Cosmic horror might not affect the player character, you're never truly rendered useless or bereft of sanity, but the player is exposed to vastly deepening threats and stakes in a way that strikes similar notes. It's an extremely intelligent game, and that's to say nothing of the in-game side quests, the ambient moments that create stark little personal memories with each player, the secret areas you can stumble into, the chalice dungeons, just a swath of free, procedurally generated dungeons to run. It really is the Souls game that keeps giving. I think Elden Ring's the only real comparison. Bloodborne's endings have been discussed to death, but I love that it mixes the vile and esoteric to truly transcend humanity. If you complete the game doing nothing extra, you wake up unsure of whether you've woken into a new dream or to reality. In either case, it's a conclusion. The second ending simply has the player replacing Gehrman as the Watcher of Dreams, meaning that while you're effectively retired, your work is never ending and the cycle continues ad nauseum. But if you find and consume 3/3 of an umbilical cord over the course of the game, generally found on the corpses of women who've birthed an infant Great One, you can fight an extra boss and become an infant Great One yourself. Yes, you're turned into a wriggling slug beast, but you're given the chance to evolve past humanity, ascend to a higher consciousness, become one with the universe, and in a world like Bloodborne's, that unenthusiastically reflects the real world and the power structures that inform it, the social strata that rise out of it, and the pain inflicted because of it, rising above base humanity is a kingly reward for the player. So yeah, outside of some annoying design stuff, I guess I figured out why I like Bloodborne. It's the coats. It was the coats all along. Coatborne 2022. Coatborne forever. Your name. It's Xbox, isn't it?
Well deduced, but irrelevant.
So show your true form then. Coward!
Yes, I am your dark half, Xbox.
Okay, let me stop you right there. I disavow all of this shit. This cringy gamer trope nonsense. Ridiculous.
That's your weakness, dogging. You know that to truly defeat me, you must become me. Do not reject the part of you that is cringe. Embrace it and ascend.
Sekiro, a review in 2 acts. Bro, check out this sweet ninja game. They went and turned Souls into a ninja sim. That's amazing. This is unreal. The movement's totally open. You can jump, you can grapple, you can do so much. Oh my god. It's nothing like Ninja Gaiden, and I love me some Ninja Gaiden, but the scope, the vision, bro. Okay, this is actually kind of hard. No big deal, it's a Souls game, but they're all hard. Like 2 was full of weird little moments, and 1 was rough at first, so whatever. To be honest, this is pretty I'm not really sure Sekiro should... Seriously, what in the I'm sorry, Dragon Rot? You're punishing the NPCs with disease because I died too much? Excuse me? I'm sorry, you lose half your money on death? I'm sorry, is this Earthbound? You what? You lose half your experience too? Are you kidding me? Oh, that camera hit different. I love highly mobile ninjas in my Souls framework. Oh, yes! Hit me with another phase of this boss fight. Give him the full health bar. Oh, I love it so. I can't. It's impossible. The game is impossible. It's impossible. Ah! Thank you for attending the dramatic recreation of my first playthrough. The sweat's still on my face. Unfortunately, it's free of tears and therefore not accurate to the original experience. Hey y'all, renowned video person KBash here, coming at you fresh off a New Game Plus playthrough, and let me just say, Sekiro, good. Huh? Yes, I do have over 40 hours played, and it took the first run to start having fun regularly. No, that isn't Stockholm Syndrome. Don't dime store shrink me. Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, is the first FromSoft title post-Dark Souls 3. It's experimental in a way that makes Bloodborne look boilerplate and mounts the stiffest challenge from the studio, period. I had to beat it twice to look at it clearly, and that's a hard sell. I think it skates by on presentation, because the actual meat is extremely tough. It takes turning your head into a tenderizer to make the thing palatable. Unless you like your shit well done, and it reminds me of games like Ninja Gaiden Black and Beautiful Joe and Bayonetta 1 in that way. Games that'll kick you up and down the neighborhood while you try desperately to have fun eating gravel. So to be clear, there's a precedent for this kind of experience. I don't hate the thing at all, but it's a disclaimer first kind of game. And unlike those games, Sekiro is 30 to 40 hours on a first run because it's just that hard. It's really no longer than Bloodborne when you know what you're doing, but the skills don't come cheap. Time is money, friend. Now, you all know I played the game subbed, but let's get a clip of the dub.
My name is Kyobu Masataka Oniwa!
Jesus Christ, I think all the corpses of the earth heard that. Sekiro is set in a fantastical Japan, one with direct references to history. It takes place during the Sengoku period specifically, but it incorporates magic, spirits, legends, and folklore, all kinds of things, to produce a deeply cultural work that's alluring, but hard to comment on without the proper experience. Regardless, you wake up in a well as Sekiro, a shinobi in service to the divine heir Kuro. Sekiro's life leading up to this point was fairly brutal. He was a war orphan raised by another shinobi and both lost an arm and died in combat with Genichiro Ashina, head of the Ashina clan, who killed Sekiro to abduct Kuro to use the child's gift of immortality, a magic passed through his bloodline, to become powerful and save Japan. Sekiro awakens because he serves Kuro, and therefore has the gift of immortality himself, and a whole bunch of other stuff gets revealed that led up to this exact moment. But to be clear, the point here isn't that the story exists, but that its contents are directly relevant to the player. It's the first major departure, setting the stage and telling a story in a way that the other games don't. You're not beholden to anyone in the other Souls games, not in the way that Sekiro is beholden to his young master and his father. And you learn really quickly that this is for sure not Dark Souls. You're made to jump, sneak past guards, and climb right out the gate. Once you got your sword, the game starts for real. While the tutorial is easy enough, the challenge ramps up significantly afterwards. So for newcomers and old heads, what about Sekiro is still Souls? Like any other title in the main lineup, life is cheap and death is part of the game. You die all the time and they plan for it, allowing the player to resurrect after death once and later more frequently. It would be a smoothing mechanic and an understandable choice given how strict the combat can be, but a full resurrection doesn't mean a whole lot when damage is so high, when bosses often have more than one life themselves, and when you're faced with any given challenge that's necessary but not quite doable without banging your head off the thing until your brain's totally remodeled. The resurrection is framed like a ninja trick. Pop back up and surprise your enemies with a backstab, but in practice the AI either lingers around a little too long, there's too many enemies in general to greenlight a stealth strike, or it's a boss and they know you're getting up. It doesn't function as advertised nearly often enough. And worse than that, the punishment for true death is harder than any other Souls game. Losing money is something I can handle. I played a dungeon crawler or two. I live in a society, and you can bank your gold in coin pouches if you know where the merchants are, but losing accrued experience, even if it doesn't ever chunk off whole skill points, is fairly demented. Demented. I don't see death in a game with 1,000 fresh threats as something narratively indicative of Sekiro losing his skills. So it amounts to a massive feels bad in general, unless you're willing to bank your skills ASAP into crappy little abilities instead of saving up. It's frustrating to grapple with as a newcomer. But KBash, sometimes the gods will throw you a bone and not penalize you as hard. Ha, that's true. Thanks for the sweet die roll to alleviate my pain. So, life is cheap. But more than that, the player's time is cheap, unless they're willing to dedicate their life to becoming a ninja master. I get it, Miyazaki, you like to play NES. NPCs are mostly the same as other Souls games. It's hard to know who's trustworthy, and their side quests are all easily missed. No different than other Souls games. But I thought it was weird how similar they felt to Dark Souls in general, where you might complete one leg of a quest, then miss a step and never see the character again. Weird because the game cares about story. But it definitely worked in other entries, so who's to say if it's questionable or not? I'm not being salty, I'm just saying it's weird, okay? It's weird that the basic gameplay is obviously warped out of control as well, but you're still mostly stuck spamming L1 between parries and other junk. Your light attack, your frame data, is still king. Setting aside that light similarity, bosses are just as punishing as ever. More so even. More than that even. They're fucking brutal. I have no idea how I beat this game. I have no idea how I beat this twice. I have no idea how my friends beat this. How the fuck y'all beat this? Lastly, the build concept is different, but intact. Though every Sekiro is equipped with the same sword, individual players will build different skill trees that rely on different shinobi prosthetics. Critically, the game allows players to personalize. That's my ticket in. These elements are good. It makes sense to keep the front-facing identity of Souls. Players will still ask each other what setup they used. Challenge runs are possible with no skills or prosthetics, and the bosses all induce groans and laughs and flashbacks between players. It's a Souls game. And yet, despite efforts to keep the experience familiar, Sekiro is radically different in so many ways. It's the closest thing to a character action game that FromSoft ever produced. It wants you to master a complex gameplay system. You aren't handed all possible combat options up front. You're meant to play through multiple times, and style is king, even if efficiency just happens to look stylish in Sekiro. It's hard to stick it in that lineage, mostly because the RPG baggage attached keeps it slightly out of the category, but I'm not super pressed about genre in the first place. Sekiro is at least split between action and Souls. So ninja combat. Dark Souls was always about patience, and Bloodborne freed the system up a bit by encouraging aggression. Sekiro feels bizarre because it walks a really tight line between passivity and hard aggro. Imagine me stalking the freshly ordered garlic pickle pizza at the family gathering, but not wanting to look desperate. It's enticing, but deeply treacherous. You can kill almost any small enemy with a single strike if you catch them unawares, but otherwise the wolf is fairly weak in combat, relegated to light sword slashes, the occasional charge attack, parries, and dodges. Most enemies block regularly, so you're not able to casually L1 spam everything to death, but that doesn't mean spamming light attacks is worthless. Combat with any enemy hinges on the posture bar, which every character has. It signifies how exhausted a character is becoming in combat. If it fills up, or breaks, the character is prone to a death blow. So combat generally revolves around filling up enemy posture bars and one-shotting them rather than dealing enough damage. Though you absolutely can chip away at an enemy's health and hit them with a coup de grace. Notably, attacks steal health bar and posture bar damage, and being low on health lowers the capacity for the posture bar to refill. So you can whittle enemies away. Staying aggressive with light attacks has compounding benefits in combat, which is why the light attack isn't worthless in a game based on death blows. I think it's pretty clever. It's worth mentioning here that you can recover your own posture bar by guarding, which is why I say that passivity over raw aggression is important to the game. Parries are the real game, though. Almost every enemy attack in the game can be parried, and parries deal piles of posture damage. It's hard to learn, even though the parry window is fairly forgiving, because the game is quick, and so many enemies have different parry timings. Regardless, it's tempting to parry everything and deal a death blow to anything you come across, but anyone who's played for any real length of time should realize that it's the blending of active defense and mindful aggression that carves through the game fastest. Regardless of all my gamer gripes, Sekiro is responsive, sharp, and impactful, fun to play, and intoxicating to master. Should have played this at 60 FPS though. What's interesting is how mobility factors into the experience. You're allowed to free run mid-combat. You can jump and pull off all kinds of maneuvers regardless of whatever's going on the ground. You can just choose to escape combat if you want. The player is given so much mobility that the game feels amazing to simply move through. The guy is fast and grapples all kinds of things with a button. It's so freeing, but combat is interesting for putting a halt on most of that freedom. No matter how you slice it, it's hard to stay crazy mobile while you're fishing for parries. I still find myself running around, dashing, jumping on occasion, but there isn't much value to randomly jumping. And this is a game that removed stamina entirely. You might think that with iframes on dodges, combat would be horrendously skewed in the player's favor, but the iframes are slim and enemies are too aggressive, too fast to perfectly weave between and keep on top of damage. And that's why I reject the dance idea the combat is sometimes sold with. It's a little too frenetic and most of the emphasis is on parries. Because of that, others have called it a rhythm game, which checks out to a degree. It's a rhythm game if rhythm games often change tempo at the drop of a hat and you're assailed with micro rhythms constantly, and honestly, if we're being really honest, the combat is bop it. It's high stakes kill murder bop it. That's not even close to a joke or exaggeration, by the way. The core combat revolves around what I've already mentioned, light attacks and parrying in time, but then the game adds sweeping attacks and stabs into the mix, requiring the player to, with a low-grade skill, tap the B button in time to counter a thrust, or to jump an incoming sweep and punish with an attack. These are reactive, hard-hitting counters that wreck enemy posture. The game is literally bop it, and I think that makes it fun, but extremely annoying when you fail because the answers every player needs are immediately accessible, but in the heat of the moment end up feeling exactly like bad QuickTime events when you're trying to learn. That's my major shrieking point. Bloodborne, Dark Souls, whatever the devs were reacting to with this setup wasn't broken. You never really had to parry in Bloodborne except arguably with Gascoigne. You could use the very basics to scrape by. But Sekiro demands a lot while punching the player in the groin for daring to try learning. So it's an experience for the repeat players, true gamers, or, like I posited in the first video, people willing to get online and get mean. You're a ninja, so why should you have to play fair? I've only really described the absolute basics of Sekiro. There's so much to learn. For example, the Makiri counter, the thrust counter that is, hardly needs to be timed at all, and can be mashed furiously, which yes, will send you dashing into an enemy, but will still give you the counter. Jumping a low attack is pretty loose as well. Precision is only really necessary for parries. The build is where the gameplay experience diverges for players. First is the Shinobi prosthetic. It's your offhand combat tool and can be fitted to cover multiple situations and counter specific enemies. If you're facing a frequent jumper, the shuriken attachment will stuff it on reaction. If you're facing a shield, the axe will reduce it to kindling. And a lot of hidden upgrades exist in the world that require deliberate searching to find. It's a high utility item and allows for multiple swappable attachments, so you can create the perfect setup to crush the game. It's the soul of the build in Sekiro. Huge missed opportunity not giving the player a command grab Izuna drop prosthetic, though. The problem is, mostly, that on original release, the thing burned through its fuel very quickly, making players less likely to use it at all, except in dire situations. And even that's a stretch, because wasting fuel in a boss battle you know you'll die in makes abusing the prosthetic a waste. And even though consumption was altered in a later patch, the cost to upgrade is still prohibitively high until late game, especially for a first-time player losing all their money dying repeatedly without realizing that light banking exists. It's a cool feature that's strained by the conditions it exists under. Like most of the game, if the fuel were readily available and cheaper than dirt, it might get more regular use, but for now, it's a power player's tool, not a regular difficulty supplement. The other aspect of the build is the skill system, a series of trees you can push points into to unlock new abilities, mostly combat tricks. It's frustratingly easy to dip into bad trees or bad skills without really understanding them, and a few unlockable trees exist, making the system, once again, fairly incompatible with newer players. I actually fully restarted the game about 2 hours in just to have access to a skill I later learned would help me beat the game because I was so off track. It's not an awful system, and a lot of the abilities are cool and highly damaging. Several change the pace of combat and meaningfully lessen the difficulty. Just good luck figuring things out yourself. Even Nioh offers the player a chance to see what the skill does. I get that watching an MP4 in-game isn't as immersive as an inky approximation, and presentation matters, but interfacing with permanent skill choices can and should be better. And yeah, okay, I'm getting a bit nitpicky, I know. Shut up, go back to having fun. Admittedly, most basic skills have endgame uses, so it's not impossible to just stick with a borked investment portfolio. So this is all really illustrative of why Sekiro is annoying annoying to talk about and read opinions about. The fact is, no matter how rewarding, the game's really rough on its players and doesn't really attempt to onboard them either. And that's hardly a new criticism in the hardcore action game scene, to be clear, but once you've got the skills, the game is so fun and epic and neat, you guys.
He clipped!
And I'm not even kidding. I love how the sword clashes sound and feel. I love how powerful yet fragile Sekiro is. How you really become a shinobi through harsh training. It pays off in spades. It just takes 40 hours of gameplay. Do you have 40 hours? Do you have $20 for a new controller? I'm not that cynical. It's just a rough experience sometimes, but the levels are something to behold. Even better than Elden Ring's ambient rating and epic scenery. Every level, minus the one or two ugly, smelly ones, is stunning, gorgeous, bathed in sunlight. They paint a mythological picture of historical Japan, and they're fun to sneak through. You're allowed to play the game as aggressively as you want, but most of the levels allow for some stealth at minimum. It's cool to be a ninja, especially in a game shooting far beyond what Ninja Gaiden and Tenchu ever did to actually encapsulate the ninja experience. And that's coming from a Ninja Gaiden stan. From Deep Lake to Tree Branch, every inch of the game feels ripe for exploration and curated for ninja gameplay. And you have so much raw power, not because of your combat abilities, but your pure mobility. You can zip out of combat in a flash if you really want to, but progression doesn't often compromise or fold to mobility. You still need to engage with the systems and mechanics to pass through the levels and take down the enemies. That's part of the beauty of the skill system, actually. You won't get any experience if you don't kill. So Sekiro has a leg up on other games in the lineage. That's right, in the sole spin-off with the greatest player capacity to avoid enemy placement and level design, you're still looped in, at least if you want to upgrade your avatar. Now, you're not forced into anything. Sekiro doesn't care if you handle things honorably or not, and frankly, honor wasn't a thing in Japan in this time period the way it's been mythologized. So, say, if you wanted to lure a mini-boss down a trail and trap her AI behind a rock so that the internal logic breaks and she can't block or escape, well, this is actually good because I am a ninja. And if you want to get butthurt in the comments about this, I use my instant kill shuriken ninjutsu and kill you instantly and then you die and your comment is gone. Many levels and bosses have some kind of associated cheese, and learning it goes further in Sekiro than other games, just on the merits of overall difficulty. But to be honest, most, quote, cheese boss strategies and tricks are so specific and difficult to execute, it's almost better to just accept you're gonna be stuck for a few hours and hitting the grinder. It's an unforgiving and uncompromising time. The good news for non-griefer types is that Sekiro is totally offline, unlike other Souls games, presumably because they wanted to craft a meaningful experience that would stick with players. One unfettered from constant interruptions and annoying comedy messages about applying one's anus to the nearest signpost. I think it paid off. The experience is respectable. Yes, the monkeys will fart and sling shit at you, but you know what? That's just contextually appropriate comedy, and it wasn't cobbled together in a tiny box by some guy farming upvotes. I think I just described my channel. Sekiro also taps into something I love about video games, and series like Soul Calibur and Sam Show specifically. It represents the platonic ideal of the duel. Two warriors, swords drawn, fighting to the death. It's one of my favorite things in gaming, cause like, I ain't pulling that shit IRL, I need my limbs. And one thing Souls struggles with is making good use of humanoid enemies. A lot of the Souls bosses are monsters, giants, and even the fights intended to evoke the duel concept feel unfair fundamentally, like you're not really on equal footing, not making use of the same tools. Bloodborne closes the gap with enemy hunters, slightly, but Sekiro pushes it to the extreme, featuring all kinds of powerful warriors to cross swords with, people to triumph over. It doesn't matter if they're huge or differently armed, your parry nullifies the differences between you and whoever you're fighting. They feel genuine even when you're technically overpowered by comparison, and the animations go so far to sell the concept. And we'll get into bosses, but it's worth bringing up that even before Elden Ring, the great open world Souls extravaganza, Sekiro allowed the player multiple diverging paths after the early game, meaning that if you hit a boss that's too hard, you can go somewhere else and occupy yourself. At least it accounts for its own filter points. I have to respect that. So filter points, or some say bosses. Sekiro is masterful at kicking players out. Anyone who calls this game easy, or sneers at general criticism regarding the gameplay, is probably getting a little too defensive of something that's empirically infuriating. Across PS4 and Steam achievements, the total percentage of players who bother to finish the game and kill the Sword Saint boss is about 30%, not accounting for secret or optional bosses. That's about the same percentage of players who beat the Nameless King, a secret boss in Dark Souls 3 that was often thought of as the hardest fight in Souls for a time. The number of players who complete the first major boss, Gyobu, is about 60%. 40% leave before finishing like the Taurus Demon basically, or Yudex Gundyr. Okay, that's not a totally fair comparison. Admittedly, the intro through to the first boss is pretty protracted. You're made to physically traverse much more space than those other examples, complete a really boring tutorial. The player will likely be distracted with entering the past at some point or have to deal with dragon rot, and between learning the game and figuring out where to go, it's understandable that several players decide that the game's not for them. Fair enough. What follows, though, traveling into Sekiro's past for an exciting night raid on the Hirata estate, is Juzo the Drunkard, followed by Lady Butterfly. This level is frustrating on its own. It's absolutely stuffed with enemies, and players will need to be pretty aggressive and mobile, able to find and use the axe prosthetic to deal with shields for the first time, possibly get demoralized like I did when they reached Juzo, and have an NPC rush in, only to find that he's difficult to save, and even if you do, there's no reward for doing so. And then walking into Lady Butterfly, a lightning-quick, camera-jarring shinobi who summons ghosts and can one-shot you with magic. It's annoying at best. That entire segment costs the game about 10% of its players, and it's not really hard to see why. But filtering can be good. It's a way to kick people out early. I usually scream at the start of my videos because I don't want some dry, spiceless to get needlessly bothered because I'm not reading a Wikipedia article. Filter first, and the remainder will be more tolerant. That's just good curation. And true enough, Sekiro only bleeds around 20% of its players afterwards, all the way through to the final boss. Now, about half of that final remainder even see the bad ending, but I did, so I guess I'm just built different. What I like about the bosses most is the upgrade system. Instead of shoving whatever rocks and materials into your weapons to buff them as much as possible, you're only really allowed to upgrade your strength with the memory of a dead boss, a consumable dropped on completion. That means you're always where you're supposed to be. You can't blame the weapon you have. The experience and the difficulty are intentional. Sekiro makes great strides to filter its players and temper the remainder. It doesn't distract with multiplayer, and it rewards the faithful with a lush world and a gripping drama, alongside the sharpest gameplay in the series. I didn't like the developer comments about accessibility in 2 because, purely based on what I played, not much was meaningfully made accessible. I can respect that Sekiro is selective about its players, even if it's really annoying. Actively limiting your base just seems like bad business. But at least it's honest. It's akin to the developer saying, yeah, this isn't for everyone, so catch a long play if you don't think you can handle it. That said, you actually have to buy and play the thing to get kicked out. That's why this shit is discourse. I've said before that the levels of Souls games are often more difficult than the bosses, at least if you're actually engaging with them and not, running on through. Sekiro's bosses are the only real standout, so hard that fighting through the level feels mandatory to a point. If I can't beat the level, can I really deal with the boss? Each of them has some kind of gimmick or consideration. They're all flavored. None are generic, and that's important in a Souls game. Usually 1 or 2 throwaways exist, light speed bumps you flatten on your way to the plot. Here you'll fight the occasional sub-boss, but you know when the real fights are happening. The early boss is focused on the grappling hook and making use of the sword and prosthetic in tandem, for the most part, but Genichiro is ridiculously punishing with attacks and asks the player to add the jump aspect of Bop It into their play alongside the Mikiri counter. It's one of the hardest early fights for demanding the full range of the player's abilities and threatening at range with the bow. Even worse, he's got 3 lives between 2 phases, meaning you need to land a total of 3 death blows to finish the fight. In his transformed state, he'll throw lightning, which can be reflected, but isn't really understandable without trying a few times, and definitely isn't tutorialized until the moment it's flying at you, which means struggling through the hardest boss up until this point in the game multiple times to get enough experience to smack him down with lightning. It's not a fun time, exactly. Really flashy though. The folding screen monkeys are probably the easiest fight in the game. Acting is more of a puzzle than a battle. I'm glad they threw a free one in for the player at some point, one that focuses more on mobility and forethought than anything, and definitely the best example of a puzzle boss in the lineage. The Guardian Ape is a fight I never learned properly. Because of how frustrating every boss is and how limited my schedule was, I went online and learned that you can run around the arena to bait the feces fling, and so I did. Wait for the ape to drop a fat thump, run under, and punish. A friend asked me if I was surprised when he got back up, but unfortunately the entire internet spoiled the moment seconds after release, so no. Cool shit attack though. The Headless Ape is a fight I did learn, however, and of course I did. It's got really clear and reactable parry windows that make the battle really epic and enjoyable all around. That clang is easily in the top 10 most satisfying game sounds. The Corrupted Monk walled me out initially. It's a complex fight, enough that the game uses it twice, so the learning curve was sure to be steep. Unfortunately, I learned here that you can buff your sword via the life-severing blade just outside the boss room, and practically bully him into submission. That was the first time I got the fight to work in my favor, and it made me realize that the game really doesn't care how you beat it, and you shouldn't either. If droves of players are leaving before reaching the final boss, if you're a ninja instead of, say, a samurai, why wouldn't you make use of every dirty trick to finish the fight? There's a diverging point in the story here, so let me talk about some specific fights before the relevant plot content. The Divine Dragon is nestled in a really difficult level, but hardly qualifies as difficult himself, mostly requiring some casual L1 management and basic aiming to zap him with lightning. It's a visually stunning fight regardless, something Sekiro does amazing work with. So many sights and scenes are just top of the pile, even for this series. The Demon of Hatred is basically a Bloodborne boss in the wrong game. See, in Bloodborne, fighting a giant monster wouldn't be an issue, with the extremely generous dodge iframes and ridiculous damage potential of most weapons. Unfortunately, it doesn't really belong in Sekiro, and I was forced, late at night and tired of my first playthrough, to cheese the fight and trick him off a cliff. Cringy? Yes, but so is this fight, so sue me. 3 death blows and a huge health bar on these damage values? So the diverging point. This ties directly into the story, so spoilers, I guess. You can engage with the story as minimally as possible and still be faced with a choice at the top of Ashina Castle on your return. The game cuts off fast travel, so you know you're meant to work your way through the stage again, this time with a mountain of experience backing your blade. There you meet the Owl, your father, effectively. The great shinobi of the land who taught you the Iron Code from a young age. Your father comes first, your master a close second. Of course, if the player is paying attention, it should be obvious that what the Owl wants from Kuro is eternal life. Nothing noble or helpful for the world at all. In obeying your father unquestioningly leads Sekiro to murder longtime ally Emma, so that's probably a yikes, and ultimately the ancient Ishin Ashina, a figure from the same old era as Owl and Lady Butterfly. There's a lot of history and even mysticism that informs the scene, but suffice it to say that slaying everyone will taint Sekiro so fundamentally that he becomes a Shura, someone who kills for the sake of killing, so thoroughly evil and without principle that he physically drips with demonic energy. Most players don't bother with this route because it's so obvious that Owl is manipulating the player, and the outcome is pretty crummy overall, but it's one potential ending. The path to the good ending starts long before Owl, but ignoring the typical Soulsborne esotericism, you'll eventually choose to disobey your corrupt father. The fight is hard, if only because he can almost fully kill you if he lands a parry, so that's fun, but he's nothing compared to the final boss. Genichiro and Ishin the Sword Saint are the actual endgame bosses. The fight is 3 full stages, and if it hasn't been made obvious by the combat's complexity, the high lethality, and the frequent multi-phase fights, Sekiro is more a game of player endurance than anything. It preys on players by putting them under extreme pressure and either shunting them entirely or forcing a player into being a fan. It's frustrating design, but undoubtedly effective, especially for a side game. They got to experiment, design a truly evil experience, and say it's for enthusiasts, and the enthusiasts get what they paid for. Sword Saint Ishin is where I cracked. Personally, I don't remember how much the controller was, but I'll be writing it off this tax season. I ended up going online and finding out you can run around the arena carefully, bait out a specific move, and punish with a single light attack. 15 minutes of this, at 3 AM on a Sunday. while texting my friend who was sleeping and probably trying to rest for work the next day. Sekiro is maybe the hardest thing I've played for the show, and easily the hardest thing I've played this year. Like I've said for other videos, you absolutely shouldn't have to play games on a schedule. So really, I made my bed and now I'm sleeping in it, but I really think this game needs a warning or something. Like, only for people with nothing going on, or for people who live with their parents and whose parents make them dinner for free, or for people who think learning languages is stupid, or for people who want to talk about how good they are at a game but who can't change an oven's bake element, for example. So Sekiro was fun. I mean, the rerun was fun. I blew through the game in 2 days, and that feels pretty good. And for experts and multi-runners, there's extra boss rush stuff, bonus costumes, so much to upgrade, and 4 total endings. It's the kind of game you can sit down and work with. An elevated version of the industry-diverging design that Dark Souls was. You too could be the next Sekiro master, a real-life virtual shinobi.
Are you finished running from your fate?
It's true, what you say. I'm not the best game reviewer, and nowhere close to the funniest or most charismatic. I barely have my life together. But I'm here, regardless.
Yes, through your own efforts, your own strength, embrace your power.
You're wrong. I didn't get myself here, even though I want to pretend I'm an island. It was them. All those people who put me where I am today. And if I can't remember that much, this whole thing was worthless.
You can't kill me. You'll destroy your cringe, your greatest strength.
Destroy cringe! I'm right here. And I'm done running. I told you, Xbox. I'm still here.
Some will criticize me for being a poor kid and playing this at 24 FPS-ish on PS4, but you know what? That's cinematic. Okay, it's not low grade, it's cinematic. Shit! Elden Ring released earlier this year, solidifying a single question in the Dark Souls discourse. Can FromSoft just miss FromSoft once? Please! Elden Ring got a lot of press. It's a smothering force in gaming. You've heard about it, and either played it, or wish everyone would shut the f up already. As someone who buys so few new games, it's my favorite thing from this year. It's effectively replaced Dark Souls 3 as the definitive Souls build game, if I get the itch. Elden Ring's roots run deep. It's an absolute feast for Souls fans, informed by every part of the lineage, and further to that, Elden Ring is the first World of Warcraft I've played since World of Warcraft. It's the first true journey I've had in years. Obviously the two aren't alike at all, an MMO versus an action RPG, but nothing else has really instilled that same sense of wonder, the hunger to explore, the ability to look out over a land you've mastered. I'm having a hard time putting words down just because of its scope. Elden Ring is enormous. It's so big that I casually managed to miss even seeing a commonly encountered NPC my friends were talking about, and I dug around the corners of the map for a long time, even in the late game, so I've definitely missed enough. But I also took the time to beat most major optional bosses. I've seen takes about Elden Ring being unreplayable, simply too large, and after completion, too predictable and tiring to bother with again. I don't think I've wanted another run of something so badly in my life, and the only thing stopping me is the mountain of other games to play on top of Xenoblade Chronicles. Elden Ring is worth the money and worth the time, if you appreciate the usual Soulsborne contest of player groin bongo. So what's on offer? It's the very first open-world Souls game mechanically approximate to Dark Souls 3 with jumping and horseback riding. Open worlds have a bit of a tarnished reputation nowadays, at least with think brains and people like me who enjoy concise, crafted experiences more than repetitious floundering in enormous content cesspits. Not that all open worlds are that, I'm just a little burnt off one too many.
It's telling me to go down? Oh god! Come on, man, I trusted you!
But Elden Ring resists that kind of complaint at a baseline. Most popular open-world games are very easy or can be adjusted down, which is good for broader audiences, but I tend to play tough games now. I like being made to pay attention, and Souls games do well there. So now, exploration has stakes. I'm tuned into the world in a way I normally wouldn't be. Even if the childlike fascination with game environments, the what's in that cave? It could be anything, even if that's faded with time almost completely. Elden Ring tunes older players into that experience by demanding engagement. Now it's genuinely, what's in that cave? Can I even get the treasure inside? Let's find out! So the functional reality of Souls gameplay, the difficulty, passively solves an issue with open world games. I think the other major issue with this genre is bloat. Piles of extraneous content and systems that muddy any kind of core experience. You're not doing anything really meaningful or interesting, but a lot of disjointed stuff. And that can be fun for some players too. Occupation is one of the key pillars of happiness making in humans, according to positive psychology. But for connoisseurs and oldos who've been there, done that, it's great to see the crafting system shoved into menus, totally optional and barely affecting the experience for most builds. I guess Souls side quests aren't served well, necessarily. They were always easily missable, but now that the world map has completely ballooned, it can be frustrating trying to figure out where this or that character ran off to.
Hotman strike. Oh my god! Oh!
Thankfully, side quests don't often have incredible rewards, certainly nothing necessary for completion anyway. It feels like the system's finally being honest with itself, like, you know what, player? Don't feel bad looking stuff up. Go ahead, you're free. That's a small but important point. Laissez-faire Souls players willing to consult a guide are usually derided by the hardcore redditeurs who figured it all out themselves. You know, having minimal real-world obligations and not accounting for personal situations and preferences. Some people like to police the gaming of others. Couldn't tell you why. But Elden Ring will force it one way or another, either because of the intensely difficult boss fights, or the side quests you can't find, or the ending you want, or the weapon you need to finish your build. Getting help online was always a developer consideration, I think. It's a series that utilized multiplayer and came out in the internet age. It's a series that sparked conversation out of game, and the broadening of scope lends credence to the idea that Souls games should be handled at the individual player's discretion. Honorable or cutthroat, the only person who really cares about your story is you. According to Dungeon Master and games industry vet Matt Colville, players of games his company worked on would endlessly barrage him at conventions with stories of their character. Like anyone could possibly care for longer than 2 minutes about your incredible fictional exploits. And I think if you have any level of social expertise, that should be understood as annoying. What you've done in a game is your own, purely your own. Why would it be any different in Souls? So the FromSoft formula applies pretty well to an open world framework. Neat. What gets lost in translation? Well, something the main games were hit or miss about, and what Bloodborne and Sekiro mastered, on repeat playthroughs that is, was the arcadey boss rush vibe. Elden Ring may be a Souls spin-off, but it's distinct from the other two titles covered in this video. In what other game could I live out the fantasy of bathing in the lava of hell? It'll feel much more familiar to Dark Souls fans than Bloodborne or Sekiro with their quickened pace and focused design, or even something like Demon Souls with its directed level selection. It really might as well be called Dark Souls 4. The major difference is fundamentally about world size and construction. Otherwise, the major selling points are intact. The build, the battles, the lore, the story structure, and, for fans, it's just a whole lot more game. The intro to Elden Ring details info about the worlds. You wake up as one of the Tarnished, people who lost the grace of the Erd Tree and were exiled by a certain monarch. Once the Elden Ring was broken, the Tarnished were lured by lost grace. And yes, we're swimming in nouns right now. And yes, this is functionally identical to Dark Souls 3. You're a person that sucks, a powerful force you're inherently linked to needs mending, you're compelled to do the thing. And entering that world for the first time, my god. Of all the things I love about Elden Ring, visual design is at the top of the pile. Demons through DS3, the world was beautiful in frames, but mostly drab or faded, and that's fitting considering the settings, the vibes of individual games, but Elden Ring pushes the visuals in such an incredible way. I'll explain myself. Okay, fantasy. Elden Ring is a fantasy game like many, many others, from Dragon's Dogma to Skyrim to Baldur's Gate, sure, but most games settle for the basic tropes of traditional fantasy presentation and stick to a specific vision. So you either get low-key medieval bland countryside, like Dragon's Dogma, Dragon Age, etc., or the game is constructed more cartoony, like Mana, leading to color-drenched environments, distilled whimsy. Elden Ring merges those opposing ethoses with a painted world, a canvas whose colors and shapes are constantly shifting, making use of truly fantastical palettes. The purple sky set amid golden leaves, the harsh red paired with blight and decay, all of it set under the golden gaze of the Erd trees, these radiant monoliths. I want as much of this as I can get in games. Genuinely. I'm leaving this on the screen for a second. Okay, appreciation time is concluded. The world is lush and multi-layered. You're free to roam the land in search of bandit camps to rout, caravans to raid. There's something on literally every part of the map. It's a unique experience in the Souls series. There just aren't chunks of significant micro-content sprinkled in the other entries. Look, there's a fortress. I can run in and kill everyone on sight for treasure. Or not. And as for being layered, the world is riddled with cave systems and mines to explore. That's expected, but you can also go deep into the earth to uncover a series of underground ecosystems. It's wild.
Yeah, quick draw is a cool skill. Man, how long does this thing go? Holy shit, dude.
Verticality was always a part of Souls, both in basic level design and world design, but Elden Ring takes it far beyond the premise. It really feels like Miyazaki is getting everything he wants. He's got a fixation for paintings, so what if the whole world was a painting? And you could find paintings in places too. Yo, I heard you like paintings, so I put a painting in your painting so you can appreciate paint. Miyazaki loves putting insanely steep drops and winding catacombs, so why not make an entire below-ground mini world? That's what I get from Elden Ring. Souls Plus. Souls Extra Large. Excuse me, would you like to upsize your souls? And like I mentioned, you can engage with the world in multiple ways, hanging out with NPCs at the Round Table Hold hub, collecting items and hunting for treasure. It's your quest, and almost everything is optional. Why are there fingers? Why are there fingers? Why are there dead fingers and multiplayer item fingers? Oh hey, here's a lore dump about fingers. Wasn't that finger... I mean, fascinating. There's something to say for something with so much to do, all of it optional, but a series of highly challenging checkpoints blocking progression. While you're never made to branch out into the wilderness, cut from the beaten path, you're usually rewarded for doing so. It's a quality way to save on mental strain. See, Souls has been kicking players out forever, mercilessly, but Elden Ring offers one of the greatest accessibility options yet, not forcing the player to keep banging their head against a wall, cause while that works for some people, others really don't like banging their head on a wall. So explore, power up, find something, anything, and by the time you're done, you'll be refreshed for another round with the boss you couldn't handle. Diverging paths have always been a part of Souls games, but Elden Ring gives you a whole-ass national park. Oh my god, I found him! The loathsome shit-eater! Let's talk about the horse, though. Overland travel wouldn't be possible in a game this size without a mount. You can freely summon and dismiss the thing unless it gets knocked out in combat, at which point you'll have to sacrifice a charge of your Estus Flask equivalent to call it back. Mounted combat is the major tack-on addition to the general Souls gameplay on offer, and it had a chance to suck. Mounted combat usually does, if only because it's an underutilized subsystem in many games. Thankfully, it's actually really good. You can easily land light or heavy strikes on opponents with a little practice. It's quick and responsive, appropriately weighty, and depending on your build, potentially optimal for keeping mobility up in certain encounters. Sometimes AAA games don't feel like every aspect is AAA, but Souls does well with mechanics. I mean, okay, no horseball shrinkage, but good enough, right? Another minor addition, though only to the Dark Souls design lineage, exists as well, the stealth system. I say system, but it's like a button, and enemies will or won't see you depending on exactly zero vision cones or indicators, you're seen or not. In one way that's kind of accurate to something like Dungeons & Dragons, the role you make, or in Elden Ring the moves you make, might be good or not, but you don't have perfect information of your enemy's perception, so you're ultimately freewheeling it, going by gut regardless of the rolls. Sneaking is cool. I think every game with rogue gameplay stapled on is trying something neat. Stabbing dudes is fun. It's especially cool to creep through a camp of enemies and pick them off. Some something you always should have been able to do in Dark Souls, especially with the way those games attempted to sell Rogue as a class type. But with Sekiro laying the base, Elden Ring finally got a system to work. It's not incredible, but it functions, a utility option instead of a complete playstyle. I guess I have to mention jumping. It took this many games, and again, Sekiro laying the base, to get a jump button in a Dark Souls game. I didn't find myself spamming jump in combat too often. It kind of depends on your build and weapon, but it can be used strategically to send a mobile hitbox at a hapless enemy, so it's a little sneakier than it looks. In that sense, it replaces the old school jump attack of Bloodborne and others well, which was slightly overcommittal and hard to make use of. The jump's been patched a couple of times too, having granted players immense invincibility frames when initially introduced, but otherwise the jump mostly gets used to bamboozle idiot enemies when you're trying to escape, or specifically for flying enemies. Good addition overall. Other than those things, gameplay, so combat, Dark Souls is about combat, is basically the same.
Okay. Oh, you idiot! You idiot!
2 buttons for each hand, stance swapping, etc. It feels more or less identical to Dark Souls 3 from basic L1 spam to weapon art, so it's hard to make new and interesting points about. The one thing that's changed is enemy diversity and boss size. Not a ton, but hear me out. The game is so big that many more enemies than usual were designed to populate the environments. While a given area might have a basic tent-post enemy type, like the horrible, disgusting centipede men in Caelid, several are transliterated across multiple zones. There's casters, warriors, zombies, hands.
No, you get it away!
You know, like Indiana Jones. Hands! Why did it have to be hands? I haven't really bothered to break down enemies across the games because for the most part, they don't matter. Like yes, they present different challenges to the player, but they're slightly different flavors of challenge. Skittles in the bag. Orange ones let you L1 spam, but purple ones make you wait. You get the picture. That's where my focus on builds and build diversity come from. Those are the elements that actually change how combat plays out. Excepting bosses, of course, but bosses often feel like the only canon challenges in Souls anyhow. I've been neglecting dexterity throughout the games, focusing mostly on strength and faith, quality, intelligence and faith, and eventually a mostly dex build, but shut up, and finally strength-focused quality. I haven't been playing rogues because a lot of Souls isn't designed for them, and shields are so massively beneficial in so many games. I didn't want to let go of mine, so I didn't. I played dexterity and intelligence, specifically wielding a cold-infused Uchigatana, and later picked up a Moonveil as well. So when Marika asked me, "Will you take my quest and become the Elden Lord?" I said, "Elden Lord? Something like that." And as tempting as that beautiful crimson Rivers of Blood katana was, I gotta say, building double damage procs via frost and bleed damage is some kind of way to play Souls. It was rewarding in a low-key way. The idea that landing consistent hits can lead to an immense payoff. Being persistent and determined is strength. Elden Ring would have been the best opportunity to go hard caster, and many have, but there's so much to do in this game with your character, even between like builds with different weapons, different weapon arts, and there's an amount of customization beyond your typical Souls game. In 3, weapons had set arts that were immutable, and while that lends value to the specific weapon you've got, in Elden Ring you can swap out your weapon arts and damage types, so instead of wielding a sharp Uchigatana with the quick draw ability, a respectful and flavorful choice, I've got an ice-laced blade and a gigantic frost stomp ability. And this is all really basic stuff. Whatever you want for your character is probably in the game. I can't get enough of it. The sheer volume of ways to test your build and your skills, between 100 mini-bosses, the main game, and every major area, it feels genuinely impossible to run out of options. For character builders, Elden Ring is paradise. Every player has a point where criticism doesn't matter. Like, if enough of this bar fills up, I'm happy, regardless of the rest. For Elden Ring, in conjunction with aesthetics, gameplay, and content, the build options make it irrefutably worth your time. That said, builds require time. I've effectively glossed 60 hours of game in a few minutes, but that's part of what makes Elden Ring special. You start as this lowly, pathetic individual, no different than other Souls games, but the lengths you have to go, the depths you have to plumb, and the pressure you're put under tell a story over time, from the weapons you wield to the armor you wear. Your character ingratiates themselves with other characters, accomplishes great things. There's always a sense that you're building to something. Characters will frequently remark that a mere tarnished could never become the Elden Lord. but it's a highly rewarding experience overall, one that tells a story with gameplay. At one point, you're offered the chance to totally reshape your appearance and even sex at will. That's a fantastical reward for the kind of fantasy Elden Ring is selling. The story of a hero on an epic journey. But let's be thorough and have a go at critiquing what's obvious. Depending on which version of the game we're talking about, completion rate is around 25% roughly. That's actually not terrible, making Elden Ring either more alluring or easier than Sekiro in total. I think there's an argument for either. Elden Ring gives the player more freedom to explore and more options for dealing with problems. Further to that, Elden Ring is a lot easier a lot of the time. The bosses just aren't designed to make your life miserable until the very late game. Some are frustrating, like Souls bosses are, but don't have multiple health bars, nor demand the same obscene level of precision. I thought Malenia was the most ridiculous fight in the game by a mile, but she's numerically twice as beatable as Sekiro's final boss. Now, a lot of factors affect this data, and my analysis is embarrassingly surface level at best, not able to account for platform discrepancy, longevity of release, etc., but it's mostly accurate to my own experience as well. Elden Ring doesn't have a lot of eject the player moments. It's smooth enough, open enough to account for a variety of players and experience levels. Some early frustrations exist, Margit the Fellowman being the usual, but if online play exists, if you can summon allies for most bosses, if you can create a summonable ally with an entirely new subsystem, if you can just leave, Elden Ring is more accessible than any other Souls game. Players are free to drop the pretense that these titles are intended to be handled very specifically, very honorably. The runaway smash hit with all the reviews and the sales and developer support is right here, openly conveying this stuff. There is one argument that I think has some weight that kinda knocks Elden Ring down half a peg. No matter how you slice it, the game simply isn't capable of delivering tightly cropped encounters in a sequence. It's genuinely incapable of providing a steady stream of ramping challenges because it's an open world with very few limits. You can end up in an extremely dangerous zone just minutes away from the starting area. To be clear, I don't think the criticism actually matters to most people. The other Souls games were pretty tightly designed, and some actually fail to provide a reasonable or clean stream of difficulty. Spikes happen all the time, just like Elden Ring, but that technical imperfection is accounted for in the intro. Once you step out of the tutorial zone, you'll meet this hulking golden horseman, and that enemy won't have any trouble wiping out a fresh Tarnished, so you either brute force it, prepping you for future problems, or take a look at the world map. You're free to go left to the coast to find a dungeon, free to go right to find all kinds of small encounters, or free to go south for an entire region that's level appropriate. You're taught that difficulty spikes will happen, and looking around to help yourself is good. I think it's kind of a Chad play to whip out that early boss fight right out the gate. That's hilarious and effective. The kind of thing safer, more pillowy open world games would never risk. It's easy, I think, to handwave criticism about the major bosses for those reasons. The player can effectively lessen the challenge, and in more than one way. Direct level ups, NPC summons, online, etc. But to be clear, most of the major Elden Ring bosses are crazy, easily harder than whatever was going on in Demons Through 3. That's something I hinted at earlier. I believe that Artorias was the first iteration of truly tight boss battles in this series, in a game that he actively subverted the design of. Not every fight was intended to be an Artorias. By 3, we see a massive proliferation in speedy and highly damaging bosses, and that's mostly subverted by the increased reliance on the dodge roll, but several fights strained credulity regardless. They were tight, demanded mastery over a certain percentage of the boss's patterns. That gets taken over the top in Sekiro, where bosses, at least on first pass, are absolute grinders. True battles of timing, endurance, and reactions. Yes, it's complex bop it, but critically it's played out under intensely stressful conditions. Elden Ring leans back from Sekiro and turns several fights into miniature or even full-blown Slave Knight Gales. So many of the required battles are multi-phase, highly mobile, devastating humanoids with deep move pools. The level of challenge ramps up gradually and gets fairly insane. I already called out Malenia because that fight is garbage. It's not even ambiguous. Her dodge windows are too tight, her damage is too high, her moves are obscene.
Oh, cool. Good.
And the only thing really saving the experience is summonable monsters. In fact, Malenia alone got me to go out and find the Mimic Veil at all. And when that failed, got me to go out and find the Black Knife Tish summon. And that doesn't feel good. Having to give up on something because, mostly, I was spending too much time on a single optional boss for nothing but pride. So I went out and removed the problem. Some other fights come close, but none really matched this one in particular. But the complexity creep of Souls bosses is endemic to the series now. The studio needs to drum up new challenges for longtime fans, so Elden Ring scales up even some of the early fights, while blowing later ones far out of proportion for the series' scope. Think of fights like Radagon, who... Wait, what happened? Think of fights like Loretta, a fairly innocuous mounted enemy, until you get a look at her damage, her mix of deadly projectiles and crushing melee attacks, her overall speed and mobility, the frequency with which she attacks, the fact that she powers up partway through the fight, making it that much harder. This is a mid-game boss. It's insane how deeply layered this fight is. They even bring her back in the late game. Well, maybe it was designed for the end and ported into a mid-range castle later. Who knows? How about this wolfman with a sword? He's found at the bottom of a castle and ends up being a regular enemy late in the game. But at the early stages is so overwhelming. Can pound your avatar so hard. It's just... Like early in Dark Souls, we fought the Taurus Demon and like Champion Gundyr, and all those fights can be hard, but they weren't super mobile. I feel like you can't be safe dodging once through an attack anymore. Like you gotta have a second queued up half the time. The trick is, neither this boss nor Loretta are mandatory. Only 13 Elden Ring bosses are actually required to complete the game, and I'm not even confident in that number. And yet the abject insanity of bosses goes back to the early stages. Market the Fell Omen is the first mandatory boss, one that frequently shunts players off the main path with his specific brand of nonsense. It doesn't feel worthwhile to even break the battles down. So few are actually necessary, and so many alternate paths around certain challenges exist, and your build factors in so heavily that Elden Ring is purely an individual experience, unless you're playing it co-op. But regardless, it's a game that you will uniquely experience and resists compartmentalization by design. There are too many builds and too many options to even begin to contend with. It's so new and so frequently patched as well that most of what I say could change in a year's time. All that's really left is a scrapbook of a journey. Now, I don't want to sloppily apply literary theory to a video game. It's doable if we're reading the game as a text, of course, but enough factors unique to games resist raw literary analysis. It's hard to weigh the worth of an author, specifically when there's programmers, directors, and publishers to worry about, when writing isn't the first concern. And that's before getting into team dynamics and other problems, you know, how the writing team interacts with the others. But I've been reading an essay by Stephen R. Donaldson on the difference between fiction and fantasy, wherein the author posits that fantasy, as distinct from mainstream fiction, features a world that is reflective of the protagonist's struggles. So a villain might reflect a part of the protagonist or shape the story purely because of the protagonist. In short, the protagonist's internal struggles are externalized. The opposite, simply fiction, would instead present a world that exists regardless of the protagonist. I often extol the virtues of a world that exists regardless of the players, across both Dungeons & Dragons and video games, because it creates believability if the intention is to allow a player to become entranced by the world, allow them to immerse genuinely. It's not that one of these modes is better, but that they value different things. Fantasy is often about hope, going out and finding the answers, setting things right with the world, which is a reflection of the self and therefore solving the self. Fiction often dramatizes the failings of mankind. The species is brittle, passionate fading flames in a cosmic framework left largely unchanged by the time the conclusion arrives. So how does Elden Ring fit into that discussion? The protagonist is a fluid individual with a role, so not someone with a highly specific backstory, but instead someone belonging to a class of persons, the Tarnished. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot to go on regarding the Tarnished as a group. They appear to be risen undead, some locked into endless life for a spoiler reason, but enough confusing and seemingly contradictory evidence makes discerning the true origins of the character a wash. So the world can't be reflective of the protagonist because they're ultimately an amorphous nobody. You go out and meet characters that have lived in the world for years, and none of them really know or care about who you are, except that this is a video game. So the world is actually designed for the player, constructed for a player character. I know, Cute trick, KBash. Nice idiot flourish. But seriously, how do you square that? Where does that leave Elden Ring? It's a video game, a multidisciplinary project by design. Literary criticism is a single vector of analysis, and so I think it's fun to open it up past what's obvious. I think Elden Ring is fiction that breeds fantasy. I've seen a lot of hand-wringing about the quality and clarity of the story, and really, I don't think it matters. It's not a super interesting discussion to me, and mostly because Elden Ring is aping Dark Souls tropes en masse to cobble the sloppiest of secondary universes, even if the branding's really good. And Elden Ring isn't meant to be understood as a clear linear narrative. It has wildly diverging ending options and optional side quests that affect the final outcome. You don't even need to take the same steps to reach the conclusion. What you need to know is that the world exists regardless of your avatar. You're fully expected to fail. There are potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of Tarnished in the world, and you have no bearing on the Academy, on the Golden City, on the Blighted Lands, or the Halig Tree, except for your physically walking through them. You're another guy in a fictional world. You don't meet challenges that reflect your character because your character is not a complete person. Elden Ring can't be used to explore your dark side. What dark side is there? Now, it could act as a fantasy and reflect the Tarnished as a concept regardless. In Dark Souls tradition, many characters are figureheads of a dying age that you're made to slaughter, but I don't think that's really an externalization of the internal reality of being Tarnished. We know almost nothing about Tarnished in general, just that they're similar to the Unkindled from 3. So yes, you could, in this ridiculous theoretical framework, say, well, I think Godric is an externalization of the internal realities of being Tarnished, Godric being the weakest demigod with the most diluted blood from the lineage, a pitiful, almost outsider to his own caste, something the Tarnished likely sees in themselves. But not every major boss is like this, so you really are just another Tarnished, another player in a multiplayer game. I maintain that it's fiction in the sense that the world goes on without the player, that the player's individuality isn't meaningfully explored or detailed enough. But a fantasy specific to the medium of video games does arise out of the experience. Every challenge, every boss defeated is a reflection of player growth in a game set to halt your progress. Like every Souls game, Elden Ring is designed as a challenge, and Miyazaki just wants players to learn to enjoy the feeling of overcoming challenge. You literally go out into the world when you're stuck, find answers, and self-actualize, become, destroy the weak part of yourself by striking down a crushing enemy. Different bosses test different things. Like any Souls game, they demand the player act accordingly to the situation and demonstrate ability, overcome adversity.
Oh no. Oh shit!
That's the functional soul of fantasy conflict. And because it's player specific, it's avatar specific, which weaves impressively well with the idea of builds, the soul of Souls, that every character handles differently, but ultimately will find the tools to overcome obstacles. If you're like me, you only want to play offline. But I did summon at least once and tried overcoming my personal weirdness with online play. And so dipping into possible solutions is lionized. Getting help and being resourceful is elevated past the weird crabs in a bucket mentality of weird online community douchebags. You can freely transcend at your discretion, and it's uplifting in a way that only Elden Ring can be. There's no other game of this scope and variance in the FromSoft catalog, none that let you conquer the game and your own shortcomings in so many unique, meaningful ways. And while many endings exist, no doubt personally important or interesting ones if the player strays from expectation, most games end with the player, unsurprisingly, becoming the Elden Lord, going out into the world and getting the prize, finding the answers. It's not a perfect analogy and mostly useless because really, I'm applying a 40-year-old essay on old ideas about fantasy and fiction to a video game like any of this matters. All art is quite useless. Getting out of the metatextual, the story's a fun romp about beating down a bunch of annoying has-beens to do what every Souls game already offered, recreating an age of mistakes top to bottom, or doing something to change the world. Either way, it's all on you. It's your game, and your fantasy. And that was Souls, a series often remembered for its difficulty but defined by its choice. I'm genuinely going to regret not spending more time with them. While games like Resident Evil 4 and other cropped adventures might make more obvious candidates for top 10 lists for their apparent design perfection, I appreciate the unhewn stone that Dark Souls and its spin-offs represent, something compelling by virtue of its resistance to newcomers, the roughness of its bumps and sharpness of its edges. They're willing to be funny and gamey and ridiculous flawless, all while presenting earnestly. Perfection is not a sustainable goal in design, and arguably nothing truly flawless is worth discussion. As I've said before, the Tetris fandom isn't exactly thriving. Souls came out raw and was rewarded with money and success, then spun out in fantastical new directions while maintaining the bases. From Bloodborne to Sekiro to Elden Ring, we see a series entrench its roots and flourish, literally warp the meta of modern-era gaming. They're profoundly significant, both for the broader implications for gaming and for the players, without being overly punishing or cruel, except perhaps for Sekiro, and that's basically an art house game. They managed to convey the value of achievement. Many games are hard, but not many work with the world and the mechanics to deliver on that experience personally and meaningfully. If you happen to catch me on a rainy day, I'll be there, somewhere in the lands between, waiting for the call.